In the year 1273, in the rolling hills of Yorkshire, a master fletcher named Oswald spent his days crafting arrows in a workshop that smelled of beeswax and newly split wood. His was a life measured in careful shavings and the patient alignment of feathers. Welcome to this quiet hour of the night. I am honored to share this time with you. As darkness settles around us, we will journey together to a timber workshop in northern England, following Oswald through his craft of arrow making with the same unhurried rhythm that carries you towards sleep. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, knowing that this story asks nothing of you but to simply listen and rest. Oswald, 41 years old, ran his calloused fingers along a shaft of ash wood, testing its straightness by feel alone. His graying red beard caught the morning light that streamed through the open doorway, illuminating thousands of wood motes drifting in the still air. The workshop held the accumulated warmth of summer, though autumn approached with its promise of cooler days. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, a habit formed over decades of solitary labor, the tunes weaving through the space like invisible threads. The ash shaft rested across his workbench, pale and smooth from yesterday's planning. His hands knew this wood intimately. The slight give of green timber, the firmness of properly seasoned pieces, the way grain patterns revealed hidden strengths. Morning dew still clung to the herbs growing in clay pots outside his door. Lavender and sage mingled their scents with the sharper aroma of wood shavings that covered the floor in soft drifts. He selected a drawknife from the rack overhead. The tool's handles were worn smooth from years of contact with his palms, fitting his grip with familiar ease. Oswald positioned the blade and drew it toward himself in one steady pull. A translucent curl of wood peeled away, releasing the green scent of living timber. Another stroke followed, then another, each one removing the smallest amount of material. His breathing fell into rhythm with the motion. Pull, pause, pull, pause. The bench held other shafts in various stages of completion. Some waited for their final smoothing. Others needed fletching. A bundle of goose feathers lay nearby, their natural oils still intact, the barbs clinging together in neat patterns. Oswald had collected these from the manor's geese last week, selecting only the finest flight feathers from the bird's wings. Each feather would be split, trimmed, and bound to an arrow with thread made from sinew. Beyond the doorway, the September landscape spread in shades of gold and green. Barley fields awaited harvest. The manor's livestock moved through distant pastures with the slowness of contented animals. Church bells from the village rang the hour of terce, their tones carrying across the valley in clear, measured strikes. Oswald counted them without conscious thought, his mind occupied with the feel of wood beneath his blade. When the shaft achieved its proper taper, he set down the drawknife and lifted a piece of rough leather. The sandpaper-like texture of the hide scraped away the finest irregularities, polishing the surface until it gleamed dully in the indirect light. His hands moved in small circles, working from the arrow's nock end toward its point, ensuring uniform smoothness. The leather whispered against wood, a sound so gentle it barely disturbed the air. Hours passed in this manner. The sun climbed higher, shifting the pattern of light across his workspace. Oswald paused to drink from a clay cup filled with small beer, the slightly sour taste coating his throat. A tabby cat emerged from behind a stack of seasoned timber and stretched, extending each leg in turn before settling near his feet. The animal's purring added a low vibration to the workshop's ambient sounds. He returned to his task with the deep contentment that had always defined his working hours. The next shaft needed attention. He examined it closely, turning it beneath his keen eye, noting a slight bow that required correction. Heat would straighten it, gentle heat applied gradually so the wood would not crack. Oswald moved to the hearth where coals from the morning fire still held warmth. He added kindling, coaxing flames to life with patient breath. While the fire strengthened, he prepared strips of linen soaked in water. These would wrap the shaft, protecting it from scorching during the heating process. The cloth felt cool against his work-reddened hands as he wound it around the wood, covering the area that needed straightening. Water dripped onto the packed earth floor, darkening it in small spots. The flames had settled into a steady burn by the time he positioned the wrapped shaft above them. Not too close, just near enough for warmth to penetrate the wood fibers. He rotated the shaft slowly, maintaining even heat distribution. The wet linen steamed, releasing moisture in thin wisps that rose toward the rafters. His humming resumed, the melody matching the pace of his rotation. Time dissolved into repetition. When the shaft grew warm enough, Oswald lifted it away from the fire and applied gentle pressure, bending it opposite to its natural curve. The wood yielded incrementally, straightening beneath his steady force. He held the position while the timber cooled, feeling the heat dissipate through the damp linen. The cat watched from its spot near the hearth, eyes half closed in feline satisfaction. After the shaft had cooled completely, Oswald unwrapped the linen and examined his work. The bend had vanished, leaving a true line from nock to point. He smiled slightly, acknowledging the small victory without ceremony, and set the shaft aside to dry fully. 3 more arrows waited for similar treatment. The morning stretched before him with ample time for each. By midday, light fell directly through the doorway, creating a bright rectangle on the workshop floor. Oswald stepped outside to eat his dinner, a wedge of hard cheese, thick sliced bread, and an apple from the manor orchard. He sat on a bench worn smooth by use, feeling the timber's warmth against his legs. The bread was dense and satisfying, requiring thorough chewing. Cheese and apple followed in alternating bites, their flavors complementing each other. Birds moved through the nearby hedgerow, calling to one another in short bursts. A light breeze carried the scent of ripening grain and distant wood smoke. The manor house stood visible from here, its stone walls solid and reassuring. Oswald had served the household for 23 years, learning his craft from the previous Fletcher, a patient man who had taught him that hurrying ruined arrows. The afternoon found him at the workbench once more, preparing to fletch the straightened shafts. This task required different materials: thread, beeswax, and those carefully selected goose feathers. Oswald arranged everything within easy reach, creating an orderly workspace where his hands could move without searching. The thread was linen, strong and fine, wound onto a small wooden spool. The beeswax sat in a shallow dish, soft from the day's warmth. He selected the first feather and split it down the center using a sharp knife, dividing it into 2 usable pieces. The blade followed the natural line of the quill, separating the vein into matching halves. Each half retained its structure, the tiny barbs still interlocked. He trimmed away excess material, shaping the fletching to the proper length and curve. His movements held the precision of long practice, neither hesitant nor rushed. The shaft lay before him, its surface ready to receive the feathers. Oswald had marked 3 evenly spaced lines around its circumference where the fletchings would sit. He ran the linen thread through the beeswax, coating it thoroughly. The wax would help bind the thread and provide protection against moisture. His fingers grew slightly sticky with the substance, but this was familiar, part of the work's texture. He positioned the first fletching against the shaft and began wrapping thread around both, securing the feather's base to the wood. The thread passed over and under, creating a tight spiral that held everything firmly. His humming filled the workshop again, the melody wandering through phrases he had learned in childhood. The cat had moved to a patch of sunlight and lay stretched full length, absorbing the warmth. Each wrap of thread required attention. Too loose and the fletching would shift during flight. Too tight and the thread might cut into the feather's quill. Oswald maintained consistent tension, his hands working independently while his thoughts drifted to pleasant memories. He recalled teaching his nephew this same process last spring, the boy's earnest concentration as he attempted his first fletching. The arrow had flown true despite its imperfect appearance. When the first feather was secured, Oswald moved to the second position and repeated the process. Thread, wax, wrapping, checking. The motions formed a sequence as natural as breathing. Sunlight continued its gradual shift across the room, marking time without urgency. Outside, the sounds of the manor's daily life provided distant accompaniment, voices calling, a dog barking, the rhythmic strike of someone chopping wood. The third fletching completed the arrow. Oswald examined his work, turning the shaft to view it from all angles. The feathers sat at proper intervals, their curves matching, their bindings secure. He set this arrow in a rack with others awaiting final inspection and reached for the next bare shaft. 4 more needed fletching before day's end. His hands moved through the familiar sequence again. Split the feather, trim it to shape, position it against the wood, wrap the thread, secure the binding. The repetition held its own comfort, like prayers recited at their appointed hours. No aspect of the work demanded novelty or surprise. Everything unfolded according to patterns established over centuries of arrow making. By the time Vespers bells rang across the valley, 3 arrows stood complete in the rack. Oswald straightened from his bench, feeling the pleasant ache of muscles used steadily throughout the day. He rolled his shoulders, stretched his back, and looked out at the lengthening shadows. The light had taken on the golden quality of late afternoon, warm and thick as honey. He moved to the doorway and stood there, letting his eyes rest on the distant hills. Smoke rose from the village hearths as families prepared their evening meals. The barley fields rippled in the breeze, creating waves of motion across their surface. A flock of rooks passed overhead, their calls harsh but familiar. Oswald watched them until they disappeared beyond the tree line. Inside the workshop, he began his end-of-day tasks. Tools required cleaning and proper storage. The drawknife received a light coat of oil to prevent rust. Wood shavings needed sweeping into a corner where they would dry for eventual use as kindling. The hearth's coals were banked carefully, covered with ash so they would hold until morning. Each action followed its prescribed order. The finished arrows went into a barrel lined with straw, protected from moisture and accidental damage. Oswald counted them as he transferred them. 23 completed this week, all destined for the manor's guards. The shafts were ash. The points would be added by the blacksmith, and the fletchings were goose feather. Standard arrows for standard purposes, made with reliable care. He filled the cat's dish with scraps from his own dinner, bits of cheese and a little bread soaked in small beer. The animal approached and ate with delicate precision, pausing occasionally to groom its whiskers. Oswald watched with mild amusement, appreciating the creature's self-contained nature. The cat had appeared in his workshop 3 summers past and simply remained, accepting food but maintaining independence. As twilight deepened, Oswald secured the workshop door and walked the short distance to his cottage. The structure sat near the manor's outer wall, close enough for convenience but separated enough for privacy. Stone walls supported a thatched roof. A single window faced east to catch the morning light. Inside, the space held simple furnishings: a bed, a table, a chest, a stool, and a small hearth. He kindled a fire using wood from his personal stack, adding larger pieces once the flames established themselves. The cottage warmed gradually, driving away the evening's slight chill. From the chest, he retrieved a bowl and spoon, then ladled pottage from the pot hanging over the fire. The thick stew contained barley, onions, and herbs, flavored with a ham bone. It had simmered since morning, the ingredients melding into satisfying sustenance. Oswald ate slowly, using bread to sop up the last of the broth. The meal filled his belly with comfortable weight. Afterward, he poured water from a jug into the bowl and washed his hands and face, feeling the day's accumulation of sweat and wood dust dissolve away. The water was cool, refreshing against his skin. He sat on the stool near the hearth, simply existing in the fire's warmth. His hands rested on his knees, palms upward, releasing the day's tension. The cottage held no sounds except the fire's occasional crackle and his own breathing. Outside, darkness had settled completely. Stars would be emerging, though he could not see them from where he sat. His thoughts turned to tomorrow's tasks. More shafts needed planning. The manor's huntsman had requested a dozen flight arrows with broader fletchings for stability in wind. Oswald mentally reviewed the materials he would need: longer feathers, slightly heavier shafts, perhaps birch instead of ash for its distinctive pale color. The huntsman liked to distinguish his arrows from others. But such considerations could wait. Evening held its own rhythms, separate from work. Oswald rose and moved to his bed, a sturdy frame filled with a mattress of straw and covered with wool blankets. He removed his outer tunic, folded it, and placed it on the chest. His body settled into the bed's familiar contours, the straw rustling softly beneath his weight. The fire's glow illuminated the cottage's interior in shifting orange light. Shadows moved across the walls as flames consumed their fuel. Oswald watched these patterns without trying to interpret them, allowing his eyes to rest on their dance. His breathing deepened, matching the fire's gentle rhythm. The blankets held the day's warmth close to his skin. Sleep approached gradually, like fog settling into a valley. His muscles released their remaining tension. His thoughts slowed, becoming less distinct, drifting into fragments of memory and sensation. The scent of wood smoke, the feel of smooth ash beneath his fingers, the sound of bells marking hours, the cat's purring, thread wrapped in spirals, feathers catching light. Outside, the night continued its own progression. Owls hunted in the woods. The manor's guards walked their rounds. Livestock shifted in their barns. The village settled into silence. And in his cottage near the workshop, Oswald, 41 years old, with work-reddened hands and graying red beard, slept the deep sleep of one whose days held purpose and whose labor brought satisfaction. His breathing was even and untroubled, his body at complete rest, held in the embrace of ordinary peace that defined his life. The fire burned lower, flames becoming embers, embers fatting to glowing coals, coals dimming to ash. The cottage grew darker, quieter, stiller. Tomorrow would bring new shafts to shape, new feathers to bind, new arrows to complete. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight held only rest, and the Fletcher rested well. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the cottage window. Oswald stirred slowly, emerging from sleep without urgency. The hearth held only cold ash now, but the September air carried no real chill. He rose from the bed and dressed in the same methodical manner he approached all tasks, tunic first, then belt, then soft leather shoes worn smooth with age. His hands moved through the familiar sequence while his mind remained pleasantly empty of complex thought. He stepped outside to find mist clinging to the ground in thin layers. The moisture dampened his face and hands, cool and refreshing. The manor grounds were quiet at this early hour, though smoke already rose from the kitchen building where servants prepared the household's first meal. Oswald walked to the well, drew water, and drank deeply from the wooden bucket. The water tasted of stone and earth, clean and cold. At the workshop, he unlatched the door and pushed it open. The familiar scents greeted him: wood, beeswax, and the faint musk of the cat, who emerged from whatever nighttime shelter it had chosen. The animal wound between his ankles once, then proceeded to its customary spot near where sunlight would eventually fall. Oswald smiled slightly at this predictable behavior and moved to rekindle the hearth. The previous day's coals still held faint warmth beneath their ash covering. He cleared away the surface layer carefully, exposing the red glow underneath. Kindling caught quickly when placed atop these embers. Small flames grew into larger ones as he added progressively bigger pieces of wood. Soon the fire crackled pleasantly, its heat beginning to fill the space. While the workshop warmed, Oswald examined the birch shafts he had set aside for the huntsman's arrows. Birch was distinctive, paler than ash, with a subtle grain pattern that caught light differently. These 12 shafts had been seasoning for months, hanging in the rafters where air could circulate around them. He brought them down one by one, testing each for straightness and checking for any splits or imperfections that might have developed. All 12 passed his inspection. He arranged them on the workbench in order, shortest to longest, though the variation was minimal. The huntsman preferred his arrows to be as uniform as possible, believing consistency improved accuracy. Oswald agreed with this philosophy. He had seen poorly matched arrows scatter across targets, their flights unpredictable due to differences in weight or balance. The first shaft required only minor shaping. He secured it in the bench's leather-padded vise and reached for a small plane, a tool designed for fine work. The blade was sharp. He had honed it just 3 days prior, and it peeled away hair-thin shavings with each pass. The birch was cooperative, its grain running straight and true. Curls of pale wood accumulated on the floor like morning frost. His humming began again, the same plain chant melodies that accompanied most of his working hours. The tunes had been taught to him by monks during his youth, when he had briefly considered taking vows. That path had not been his, but the music remained, woven into the fabric of his days. The notes rose and fell in modal patterns, neither major nor minor, existing in their own timeless space. By mid-morning, 6 shafts had received their initial shaping. Oswald paused to rest his hands and drink more water. The sun had burned away the mist, revealing a clear sky of deep blue. Through the doorway he could see the barley harvest beginning in the nearest field. Workers moved in a line, swinging scythes in coordinated rhythm. The sound of blades cutting through grain stalks carried across the distance, a steady swishing that spoke of autumn's arrival. He returned to the bench and selected broader feathers from his collection. These came from the manor's larger geese, birds raised specifically for their size. The huntsman wanted maximum stability, and broader fletchings would catch more air, steadying the arrow's flight even in strong winds. Oswald examined each feather individually, looking for damage or weakness. Only perfect specimens would serve. The process of splitting and trimming these larger feathers required additional care. More surface area meant more opportunity for error. He worked slowly, his knife following the central quill with absolute precision. Each cut released a faint scent, the natural oils of the feather combining with the sharpness of freshly exposed keratin. His calloused fingers handled the delicate material with surprising gentleness. When the first fletching was prepared, he held it up to the light streaming through the doorway. The translucent quality of the feather revealed intricate patterns, barbs interlocking in precise arrangements, creating strength through interconnection. Nature's engineering never ceased to satisfy his observant eye. Such complexity arose without conscious design, yet functioned perfectly for its purpose. He set the prepared fletching aside and reached for another. The cat had moved to follow the sun's progress, now lying in a different patch of warmth. Its breathing was slow and even, the picture of contentment. Oswald envied the animal's capacity for simple pleasure: find warmth, claim it, rest fully. Humans complicated such matters with endless considerations, but perhaps there was wisdom in the cat's approach. The morning progressed through its measured course. More feathers were split and shaped. The fire required occasional attention, a fresh log added when flames diminished. Sounds from outside marked the passage of time, the harvesters' voices, cart wheels on packed earth, church bells ringing sext at midday. Oswald worked through it all with steady focus, his hands engaged while his mind rested in the deep contentment that defined his inner landscape. He broke for his midday meal when the bells finished their ringing. Today's bread was from yesterday's baking, slightly firmer but still good. He had cheese again, and dried apples from last autumn's harvest, their sweetness concentrated by the drying process. He ate outside on his bench, watching the harvest work continue in the field. The workers moved with practiced efficiency, completing one section before advancing to the next. A light breeze had developed, carrying the scent of cut grain and freshly turned earth. The combination was distinctly autumnal, marking the season's transition. Oswald breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the familiar smells. This time of year had always pleased him, the urgency of spring planting finished, the harshness of winter not yet arrived. Autumn existed as an in-between space, neither one thing nor another, simply itself. After eating, he allowed himself additional rest. His body appreciated these pauses, particularly now that 41 years had accumulated in his joints and muscles. Age brought certain changes, longer recovery from exertion, greater appreciation for stillness, deeper understanding of patience. He accepted these developments without resistance, recognizing them as natural progressions rather than losses. The afternoon's work focused on fletching the huntsman's arrows. Oswald had prepared all the feathers during the morning, so now came the task of binding them to shafts. He took up the first birch arrow and marked its 3 positions with light charcoal lines. The marks would be covered by the thread wrappings, but they provided guidance for proper spacing. Thread through beeswax coating the fibers thoroughly. The first fletching positioned carefully against the shaft, the initial wrap of thread securing the base, then the methodical progression of wraps, each one building on the previous, creating a structure that would hold firm through repeated use. His fingers moved with automatic precision, requiring no conscious direction. The body remembered these movements, stored them in muscle and nerve. Outside, shadows had begun their afternoon lengthening. The harvest crew took their own break, gathering in the field's shade to share bread and ale. Their voices carried to the workshop as indistinct murmurs, the sound of community at rest. Oswald continued his work, adding the second fletching to the arrow, then the third. When complete, he examined the result with satisfaction. The broad feathers sat at perfect intervals, their curves matching, their bindings secure. 1 arrow finished, 11 remaining. He reached for the next shaft and began again. Thread, wax, feather, wrapping. The repetition held a meditative quality, similar to the prayers he had learned in his youth. Perhaps all focused labor contained an element of devotion, attention paid fully to the task at hand, the mind surrendered to the work's demands. Whether crafting arrows or copying scripture, the principle remained constant. The second arrow joined the first in the rack, then the third. The afternoon unfolded in this manner, each arrow receiving the same careful treatment. The sun moved across the sky in its ancient arc. The cat woke, stretched, groomed itself, and settled into sleep again. The fire burned steadily, warming the workshop without overheating it. Everything proceeded according to its natural rhythm. By the time Vespers bells rang, 8 arrows stood complete. Oswald's hands ached pleasantly from the day's work, not pain exactly, but awareness of muscles used thoroughly. He flexed his fingers, working out the stiffness, and decided to finish the remaining 4 on the morrow. Evening approached, and with it the familiar transition from work to rest. He performed his usual closing tasks, tools cleaned and stored, shavings swept, fire banked, the completed arrows placed carefully in their protective barrel, everything prepared for tomorrow's resumption. The workshop took on a settled quality, like a room exhaling after the day's exertions. Oswald felt a similar settling in his own body, the gradual release of focus and effort. The walk to his cottage traversed the same path as always. His feet knew every irregularity in the ground, every stone's placement. Twilight had begun its slow descent, softening edges and muting colors. The harvest field stood partially completed now, neat rows of cut grain contrasting with sections still standing. Tomorrow the work would continue, advancing across the remaining area until the entire field lay harvested. At the cottage, Oswald rekindled his personal hearth and reheated the pottage. The stew had thickened overnight, becoming denser and more flavorful. He ate with good appetite, sopping up the broth with fresh bread obtained from the manor kitchen. The bread was still slightly warm, its crust crackling under his fingers. Simple food, but satisfying in its straightforward nature. After the meal, he sat once more near the fire, hands resting quietly in his lap. The day had been productive without being strenuous. Tomorrow held similar prospects: finish the huntsman's arrows, perhaps begin work on standard shafts for the guards. The rhythm of his work life continued its reliable progression, one day flowing into the next without disruption or surprise. His thoughts wandered to his nephew, the boy he had begun teaching last spring. The child showed promise, his hands already developing the sensitivity needed for fine work. In a few years, perhaps the lad could serve as proper apprentice, learning the craft fully. Oswald found the prospect pleasing. Knowledge passed from generation to generation created continuity, linking past to future through shared skill. But such considerations belonged to time not yet arrived. Tonight held only the immediate present: fire warmth, body tiredness, the approaching comfort of sleep. Oswald moved to his bed when drowsiness came, settling into the straw mattress with familiar ease. The blankets wrapped around him, holding the day's accumulated warmth close to his skin. Darkness filled the cottage as the fire diminished to coals. Outside, night sounds began their chorus: crickets in the grass, an owl calling from the woods, the distant bark of a dog. Oswald listened without analyzing, simply allowing the sounds to wash over him. His breathing deepened, slowed, became the breathing of sleep. In his workshop, the cat curled in its chosen spot, body curved into a tight circle. The finished arrows stood in their barrel, waiting for tomorrow's completion of their fellows. Tools hung on their pegs, ready for use. Wood shavings lay in their corner, dry and fragrant. Everything rested in its proper place, held in the stillness of night, waiting for dawn's return and the resumption of work. Dawn arrived with the same gentle insistence as always. Oswald woke to birdsong filtering through the window, a chorus of sparrows greeting the new day. He lay still for a moment, allowing consciousness to return gradually. The cottage held the coolness of night, but not uncomfortably so. He rose and dressed, his movements unhurried, and stepped outside to greet the morning. The sky showed clear again, promising another fair day for the harvest. Dew covered everything in tiny droplets that caught the early light, transforming ordinary grass into something briefly magical. Oswald walked to the well, drew water, and splashed it on his face. The shock of cold cleared away the last remnants of sleep, leaving him alert and ready for the day's tasks. At the workshop, he he found the cat already waiting by the door, sitting with patient expectation. He unlatched the entry and allowed the animal to precede him inside. It went directly to its preferred spot, settling there despite the absence of sunlight at this early hour. Oswald smiled at such optimism. The creature knew sun would eventually arrive and claimed its territory in advance. He rebuilt the fire from yesterday's banked coals, adding kindling and then larger pieces. The flames grew steadily, filling the space with warmth and the comforting crackle of burning wood. While the workshop reached a comfortable temperature, Oswald examined the 4 remaining shafts that needed fletching. They sat on the bench where he had left them, waiting patiently for completion. The birchwood glowed pale in the morning light. He ran his work-reddened hands along each shaft, checking once more for any imperfection that might have revealed itself overnight. Wood could be unpredictable. Moisture changes sometimes caused warping or splitting. But these shafts remained true, their surfaces smooth and their straightness intact. He prepared his materials with the same deliberate care as always. Thread unwound from its spool. Beeswax positioned within easy reach. The prepared fletchings arranged in order. Everything assembled so his hands could move without interruption once the work began. This preparation was itself part of the craft, as important as the actual binding. The first arrow received its fletchings in the established sequence. Thread through wax, first feather positioned, wrapping commenced. His humming resumed, filling the workshop with its familiar melody. The plain chant rose and fell in its modal patterns, neither joyful nor sorrowful, simply existing as sound moving through space. The cat's ears twitched occasionally in response to particular notes. Oswald's mind wandered while his hands worked. He thought about the changing season, how autumn gradually asserted itself over the landscape. Soon the leaves would turn, painting the woods in shades of gold and rust. Geese would gather for their southern journey, their formations passing overhead in long, wavering lines. The air would acquire a sharper edge, hinting at winter's eventual arrival. But those changes remained ahead. Today existed in the gentle space between summer's warmth and autumn's crispness. The temperature held at comfortable levels. Harvesting continued at a measured pace. Life at the manor proceeded according to its established rhythms. Nothing demanded urgency or provoked concern. The second arrow joined the first in the rack, 2 remaining. Oswald reached for another shaft and began again. The repetition never troubled him, rather, it provided a kind of comfort. Each arrow was unique in minor ways, requiring small adjustments in technique, but the overall process remained constant. This balance between variation and consistency suited his temperament perfectly. Through the open doorway, he could see morning activities beginning around the manor. Servants moved between buildings, carrying out their assigned duties. The blacksmith's hammer began its rhythmic striking, metal ringing against metal. Chickens scattered across the yard, pecking at ground that had been swept clear of grain. A dog trotted past, intent on some canine purpose known only to itself. The third arrow received its fletchings. 1 more remained. Oswald worked without haste, giving this final arrow the same attention as the first. The thread wrapped smoothly around shaft and feather. His fingers maintained consistent tension. The beeswax held everything securely. When he tied off the final binding and trimmed the excess thread, all 12 arrows stood complete. He lifted them from the rack and examined the set as a whole. The uniformity pleased him. Each arrow matched its fellows in length, weight, and fletching. The huntsman would be satisfied with these. They would fly true, grouping tightly on targets or finding their marks in the field. Good arrows resulted from patient work, and Oswald had been patient. The morning was not yet half spent. He decided to begin work on standard shafts for the guards, though these required less specialized treatment than the huntsman's arrows. He selected ash wood from his stores, reliable, strong, readily available. A dozen guards' arrows could be roughed out before midday if he maintained steady effort. He secured the first shaft in his vise and took up his drawknife. The familiar weight settled into his palms, the handles worn to fit his grip exactly. The first stroke removed a thin curl of wood, pale and aromatic. Another stroke followed, then another. The rhythm established itself quickly. Pull, examine, pull, examine. His body knew this sequence so thoroughly that conscious thought was unnecessary. Wood shavings accumulated around his feet in drifts that would later be swept into the kindling pile. Nothing went to waste in his workshop. Even the smallest scraps found purpose eventually. This economy of resources was not born of poverty, but of respect. Materials deserved to be used fully, their potential realized completely. The sun had climbed high enough now to send direct light through the doorway. The cat moved into this illumination, stretching luxuriously before settling back into sleep. Its fur glowed in the brightness, each hair catching light individually. Oswald paused in his work to appreciate the simple beauty of this animal, sunlight, peaceful workshop. Such moments required no more than awareness to become complete. He returned to the shaft, continuing its transformation from rough timber to finished arrow component. The drawknife peeled away layers, revealing the wood's inner character. Some ash was dense and tight-grained. Other pieces showed wider spacing, indicating faster growth. Both types served well for arrows, though the denser wood typically performed better for heavy use. By the time prime bells rang from the village church, 4 shafts had received their initial shaping. Oswald set down his tools and stepped outside to rest his hands and eyes. The harvest crew was already at work in the field, having started at first light. They had made good progress. More than half the barley now lay cut and gathered into sheaves. Another day or two would see the task completed. He walked a short distance from the workshop, loosening his shoulders and back. Long periods at the bench sometimes created stiffness, particularly in his lower back. Movement helped, as did stretching. He raised his arms overhead, feeling muscles extend and release. His body appreciated these brief interludes of different activity. A servant passed carrying a basket of bread fresh from the kitchen. The scent wafted toward Oswald, rich with yeast and grain. His stomach responded with interest, reminding him that morning had been long and breakfast distant. He returned to the workshop to fetch his midday meal, cheese, bread from yesterday, and apples that were beginning to wrinkle slightly but remained perfectly edible. He ate slowly on his bench outside, watching clouds drift across the blue expanse above. Their shapes transformed constantly, edges blurring and reforming. Some appeared solid and distinct. Others were barely visible wisps. All moved according to winds blowing at heights beyond human reach. Oswald found their movement soothing, a reminder that change was natural and constant. After eating, he allowed himself a longer rest than usual. The morning's work had been productive. An afternoon would bring its own demands. He leaned back against the workshop's outer wall, feeling the sun's warmth on his face. His eyes closed of their own accord, not sleeping but resting in that space between wakefulness and slumber where thoughts become vague and unformed. Time passed in this suspended state, perhaps a quarter hour, perhaps longer. When he opened his eyes again, the sun had shifted slightly, creating new patterns of light and shadow. He felt refreshed, his energy renewed. Standing, he stretched once more and returned to the workshop's interior. The afternoon's work continued where morning had left off. More shafts required shaping. He took up the drawknife again and resumed the familiar motion. Pull, examine, pull, examine. His humming accompanied the work, the plain chant melodies weaving through the space. The cat had moved to a shadier spot, avoiding the direct sunlight that now filled the workshop's southern half. Each shaft received individual attention despite their standardized purpose. Oswald's observant nature would not allow careless work, even on routine tasks. Every arrow deserved proper crafting, whether destined for a huntsman's special use or a guard's daily practice. The principle remained constant: make it well, make it true. The drawknife moved steadily across wood surfaces. Shavings fell. The pile of completed shafts grew. Outside, the afternoon progressed through its usual stages. The harvest crew took their break, resting in whatever shade they could find. The manor's activities continued their daily patterns. Chickens scratched. Dogs drowsed. Life unfolded according to rhythms established over generations. By the time none bells rang, 8 shafts stood ready for their next stage of preparation. Oswald examined them with satisfaction, noting their uniformity. Tomorrow or the next day he would smooth them with leather, check them for straightness, and begin the fletching process. The work would continue its steady progression, one stage following another until arrows emerged complete. He considered continuing, but decided instead to address a different task. Several older arrows needed inspection and potential repair. The guards sometimes returned arrows with damaged fletchings or loose bindings. These could often be salvaged with modest effort, extending their useful life. Waste troubled him more than extra work ever could. He retrieved a basket containing arrows flagged for inspection. Some showed obvious problems: missing feathers, cracked shafts, loose points. Others appeared intact but had been set aside for reasons he would need to discover. He laid them out on the bench, arranging them by apparent condition. The worst cases went to one side, the questionable ones to the other. The first arrow had lost a fletching entirely, torn away by impact with something resistant. The remaining 2 fletchings were intact, their bindings still secure. Oswald cut away the damaged binding site, cleaned the shaft, and prepared to attach a replacement feather. This repair work required the same skills as new construction, but applied to damaged materials. The challenge lay in matching the existing work, creating continuity between old and new. He selected a feather similar to those already present, split and trimmed it to match their size and shape, and positioned it carefully at the vacant spot. Thread through wax, wrapping commenced, binding secured. When finished, the repaired section blended seamlessly with the originals. The arrow would fly true again, returned to service rather than discarded. 3 more arrows received similar attention. One needed complete refletching, its feathers too damaged to salvage. Another required only tightening of loose bindings, accomplished by adding a few additional wraps of waxed thread. The third had developed a slight crack in its shaft, too minor to compromise function, but worth monitoring. Oswald marked it with a small notch so he would recognize it if it returned for inspection again. The afternoon was drawing toward evening when he completed the repair work. Shadows had grown long, stretching across the workshop floor in dark bands. The air had cooled slightly, losing the day's accumulated warmth. Vespers bells would ring soon, marking the transition from work time to evening rest. Oswald began his closing routine, moving through the familiar sequence. Tools cleaned and returned to their places. Work surfaces swept clear of debris. Fire banked for the night. Materials organized for tomorrow's resumption. The workshop transformed from active workspace to dormant storage, waiting quietly for dawn's reactivation. The huntsman's completed arrows needed delivery. Oswald gathered them carefully, wrapping them in cloth to protect the fletchings during transport. He would take them to the manor house now before full darkness arrived. The walk was short, the path well known, but carrying finished work always brought a particular satisfaction. Tasks completed, promises fulfilled. He secured the workshop and set out across the manor grounds. The harvest field lay quiet now, the crew having finished for the day. Sheaves stood in neat rows, waiting to be gathered and transported. The work was nearly done. Perhaps one more day would see it completed. Then the field would lie empty until spring's planting renewed the cycle. At the manor house, Oswald delivered the arrows to the huntsman's quarters. The man examined them with approval, testing their straightness, checking the fletching quality, noting their uniformity. He nodded his satisfaction and thanked Oswald, adding that more would likely be needed before winter. Oswald acknowledged this and departed, his errand complete. The walk back to his cottage led through twilight deepening toward night. Stars were becoming visible overhead, emerging one by one as darkness claimed the sky. The evening air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke and autumn earth. Somewhere nearby, someone was cooking onions. The sharp, sweet smell drifted on the breeze. At his cottage, Oswald rekindled the hearth and prepared his evening meal. Tonight he had pottage again, but also a piece of chicken obtained from the manor kitchen, payment for the delivered arrows. The meat was a welcome addition, providing richness to complement the stew's vegetables and grains. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for this modest abundance. After eating, he sat near the fire as had become his custom. The day's work settled into memory, joining the accumulated store of days that comprised his life. Nothing dramatic had occurred, nothing unexpected. Yet the day had been good, productive, peaceful, satisfying in its ordinary way. Such days formed the foundation of contentment, he had learned. Drama and excitement were overvalued. Steadiness and routine held deeper rewards. His hands rested on his knees, palms upward, releasing their day's tension. The fire's warmth penetrated his skin, soothing muscles that had worked steadily since morning. Outside, full darkness had arrived. The manor settled into nighttime quiet. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, continuing the work's endless progression. But tomorrow could wait. Tonight held only rest. Oswald moved to his bed when sleep approached. The straw mattress received his weight with familiar accommodation. Wool blankets wrapped around his body, holding warmth close. His breathing deepened naturally, requiring no conscious effort. Thoughts fragmented into sensory memories, wood grain under fingers, thread wrapping around shaft, sunlight on cat's fur, the taste of bread and cheese. Sleep came easily, as it always did after days of honest labor. His body surrendered to rest, muscles releasing completely. In the workshop, tools hung on their pegs in perfect order. Completed arrows stood in their barrel. New shafts waited for tomorrow's attention. Everything held its place in the darkness, suspended in the stillness between one day and the next. The night deepened around the cottage. Stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient patterns. The manor's guards walked their rounds, ensuring safety. In distant fields, animals moved through their nocturnal routines. And in his simple bed, Oswald, 41 years old, with work-reddened hands and graying red beard, rested in the profound peace that comes from days well spent and work well done. The following morning brought with it a change in weather. Oswald woke to the sound of rain pattering against the cottage roof, a gentle percussion that spoke of autumn's full arrival. He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the gray landscape. The rain fell steadily but without violence, the kind of rain that would settle into the earth rather than rush away in streams. He dressed warmly, adding an extra woolen layer beneath his tunic. The cottage held more chill than previous mornings, dampness creeping through the walls. At the hearth, he built up the fire larger than usual, knowing the workshop would need additional warmth today. Flames grew quickly, fed by dry wood from his carefully maintained supply. The walk to the workshop required navigating puddles already forming in the low places along the path. Rain soaked through his hood, running in rivulets down his neck despite his attempts to stay covered. The dampness was not unpleasant, merely present, a fact to be accepted rather than resisted. He had worked through countless rainy days over the years. This one would be no different. Inside the workshop, he shook water from his cloak and hung it on a peg near the hearth where it could dry. The cat was already present, having found entry through some gap known only to itself. The animal sat grooming its fur with concentrated attention, removing any moisture that had collected during its own journey. Oswald built up this fire as well, creating warmth that would counteract the day's dampness. Rain drummed steadily on the thatched roof overhead, a constant backdrop of sound. Water dripped from the eaves, creating small pools just beyond the doorway. The day's light was subdued, filtered through clouds that showed no sign of breaking. Such weather meant working by firelight more than sunshine, but Oswald's tasks required no brilliant illumination. He moved to examine yesterday's work, the 8 ash shafts awaiting their next preparation stage. The wood had absorbed some moisture from the air overnight, though not enough to cause concern. He would let them sit near the hearth today, allowing warmth to drive out any dampness before continuing their transformation. Wood and weather maintained a constant dialogue, each affecting the other in subtle ways. Instead, he turned his attention to fletching preparations. He had an ample supply of split feathers ready, but additional ones could always be prepared for future use. This task suited rainy day work perfectly. It required good light but could be done near the fire, and the delicate feathers benefited from the drier air near the hearth. He gathered his collection of whole feathers and settled onto his stool, positioning himself where firelight and the day's dim illumination combined most effectively. The knife in his hand was small and sharp, designed specifically for this detailed work. He selected the first feather and examined it closely, looking for the natural line that would guide his split. The blade followed the quill's center, dividing the feather into two symmetrical halves. Each half maintained its structure, barbs still interlocked despite the separation. He set these aside and reached for another feather. The motion became rhythmic: select, examine, split, set aside. His humming accompanied the work, plain chant melodies rising above the rain's steady percussion. Hours passed in this manner. The pile of prepared fletchings grew steadily. Rain continued without pause, sometimes strengthening to a heavier drumming, sometimes diminishing to barely audible whispers. The fire required regular feeding to maintain its warmth. The cat dozed in its chosen spot, unbothered by the weather, content in its dry shelter. By midday, Oswald had prepared enough fletchings to outfit several dozen arrows. His hands ached slightly from the precise cutting, but pleasantly so. The ache of muscles used skillfully rather than strained. He set aside his knife and stretched his fingers, working out the stiffness. Time for his meal, though the rain made eating outside unappealing. He ate in the workshop instead, sitting near the fire with bread, cheese, and dried meat. The warmth felt good against his skin. Rain had cooled the air enough that comfort required proximity to flames. He chewed slowly, watching water stream past the doorway. The harvest field would be receiving this rain, the cut barley hopefully already gathered and stored. Timing mattered greatly in farming. Rain that would have been welcomed a month ago could spell disaster now. But the manor's steward was competent, and the harvest had progressed well. Likely the grain was safe in the barns, protected from moisture. The rain would benefit the soil, preparing it for next year's planting. Everything moved in cycles: harvest and planting, growth and dormancy, wetness and dryness. Understanding these patterns brought peace rather than anxiety. After eating, Oswald considered his options for the afternoon's work. The ash shaft still needed more drying time. He could continue preparing fletchings, but his hands requested different activity. His gaze fell on the arrows awaiting final inspection before delivery to the guards. These could be examined, tested for balance, given final approval. He retrieved them from their storage barrel and laid them out on the bench. Standard arrows, meant for practice and routine use rather than specialized hunting. Each one had been crafted with care nonetheless. He took up the first arrow and held it horizontally, resting it across his extended finger to find its balance point. The point should sit slightly forward of center, allowing the arrow to fly nose first rather than tumbling. This one balanced well. He sighted down its length, checking for straightness. No warp or deviation was visible. The fletching sat firmly, their binding secure. He set it in the approved section and reached for the next. The inspection process was methodical, each arrow receiving the same careful scrutiny. Most passed without issue. Two showed minor imperfections that required small adjustments. The first of these had a slightly loose fletching. The binding had not failed, but neither was it as tight as Oswald preferred. He took up his waxed thread and added several additional wraps, securing the feather more firmly. A few moments' work corrected the problem. The arrow joined its fellows in the approved section. The second arrow's shaft showed the beginning of a small split near its nock. This was more serious. A split could propagate during use, causing catastrophic failure. Oswald examined it closely, determining whether repair was possible or if the shaft needed replacement. The split was shallow, barely penetrating the wood's surface. Careful treatment might stabilize it. He heated a small amount of resin over the fire until it became liquid and workable. This tree sap, collected from pines in the nearby forest, served as both glue and sealant when properly prepared. Using a thin stick, he worked the warm resin into the split, forcing it deep into the wood fibers. The resin would harden as it cooled, binding the split and preventing its expansion. While the resin was still pliable, he wrapped the area tightly with fine thread, creating additional reinforcement. The combination of resin and thread should hold the shaft together indefinitely, assuming the arrow saw only normal use. He marked it with a small notch, a signal to himself that this arrow had been repaired and should be monitored if it returned for future inspection. The afternoon progressed through its gray, wet hours. Rain showed no sign of stopping, though its intensity varied. Sometimes it fell in sheets that obscured the view beyond the doorway. Other times it diminished to a fine mist barely heavier than fog. The rhythm of its sound became part of the workshop's atmosphere, as familiar as the fire's crackling or the cat's occasional movements. Oswald completed his arrow inspection and turned to other small tasks that rainy days made possible. He sharpened tools that had dulled slightly with use. He organized his supply of thread, winding loose ends onto their proper spools. He examined his stock of beeswax, noting that he would need to obtain more before winter. These maintenance activities required no great concentration, but kept his hands occupied and his workshop in proper order. The cat woke from its nap and stretched elaborately, each leg extending in turn. It approached Oswald and rubbed against his leg, a request for attention or perhaps food. He reached down to scratch behind its ears, feeling the animal's purr vibrate through his fingers. The cat accepted this attention briefly, then moved away to investigate interesting scents near the wood pile. By the time none bells rang, their tones muffled by rain and distance, Oswald had completed his various small tasks. The workshop had that satisfied quality of a space well maintained, everything in its proper place and ready for use. He added fresh wood to the fire and settled onto his stool, simply sitting for a while. The day required no urgency, and the rain invited stillness. His thoughts wandered without particular direction. He remembered learning this craft from old Edmund, the previous Fletcher who had taken him on as apprentice. The man's patience had been remarkable, his willingness to explain and re-explain until understanding came. Oswald tried to honor that memory by showing similar patience with his own nephew. Knowledge passed through generations this way, each teacher remembering their own learning. The rain began to lessen as afternoon moved toward evening. The drumming on the roof grew quieter, the streams from the eaves reduced to occasional drops. Clouds remained thick overhead, but their character had changed, no longer actively releasing moisture, simply hanging gray and heavy. Oswald rose and stepped to the doorway, looking out at the saturated landscape. Everything glistened with wetness. Puddles reflected the gray sky. The manor's buildings appeared darker, their stone and timber surfaces soaked through. No one moved about unnecessarily. All had retreated to whatever shelter their work allowed. The harvest field stood empty, its cut stubble flattened by rain. Tomorrow, if the weather cleared, normal activity would resume. But today had belonged to water and stillness. He began his evening routine earlier than usual. The shortened daylight of the rainy day made it feel later than the hour actually was. Tools were cleaned and returned to their places. The fire was banked carefully. Damp weather required maintaining coals overnight to make morning rekindling easier. The cat was given its scraps, which it consumed with typical feline delicacy. Oswald secured the workshop and made his way to the cottage through the drizzle that remained. His cloak was already damp, so the additional moisture made little difference. Inside, he built up his personal fire and changed into dry clothing. The wet garments he hung near the hearth to dry overnight, draped over a wooden frame made for this purpose. His evening pottage had thickened considerably from multiple reheating. It had become more of a solid mass than a stew, but this made it easier to eat and no less nourishing. He added a splash of ale to thin it slightly and heated it through. The result was hearty and warming, perfect for a damp evening. He ate with good appetite, mopping up every bit with fresh bread. After the meal, he sat near the fire with a piece of wood he had been gradually carving into a simple bowl. This was hobby work rather than professional craft, something to occupy his hands during evening hours. The bowl was taking shape slowly, hollowed out bit by bit over many evenings. There was no deadline for its completion, no expectation beyond the pleasure of the work itself. His knife moved in small, controlled cuts, removing tiny chips of wood. The bowl's interior deepened gradually, its walls maintaining even thickness. The wood was apple, salvaged from a tree that had fallen during a storm last spring. Its grain showed beautiful patterns, revealed slowly as the carving progressed. When finished, perhaps by winter's end, the bowl would be both useful and handsome. Outside, full darkness had arrived early due to the heavy cloud cover. The cottage felt especially cozy in contrast to the wet gloom beyond its walls. Fire warmth, dry clothing, simple food, and quiet work. These constituted comfort in its most basic form. Oswald felt deep contentment settle over him like a well-worn blanket, familiar and entirely satisfying. He worked on the bowl until his hands grew tired and his eyes began to strain in the firelight. Setting it aside, he prepared for bed. The straw mattress felt especially welcoming after the day's dampness. Wool blankets provided weight and warmth. His body relaxed completely, grateful for rest after a day of steady, if undemanding, activity. Rain had resumed outside, drumming softly on the roof. The sound was soothing rather than troubling, a lullaby of sorts. Oswald listened to it without analysis, simply allowing the rhythm to wash over him. His breathing slowed and deepened. Thoughts fragmented into sensory memories, the feel of wet wool, the warmth of fire, the grain of apple wood under his knife, the taste of thick pottage. Sleep came gently, arriving like the rain itself, gradually, naturally, without announcement. His body surrendered to it fully. In the workshop, arrows stood in their barrel, tools hung in their places, and prepared fletchings lay in neat stacks. Everything waited quietly in the darkness. Tomorrow the sun might return or rain might continue. Either way, work would resume, following its eternal rhythm. But tonight held only rest, and the Fletcher rested deeply, peacefully, completely. Morning came with clearing skies. Oswald woke to find pale sunlight streaming through the cottage window, the first direct light in 2 days. He rose and looked outside to see puddles reflecting blue sky, the clouds having finally moved on during the night. The air smelled fresh and clean, washed by yesterday's rain. Birds sang with particular enthusiasm, as if celebrating the weather's improvement. He dressed and ventured outside, feeling the ground soft and yielding beneath his feet. Moisture still clung to everything, grass, walls, the workshop roof, but the sun would gradually reclaim this dampness. Already warmth touched his face, promising a pleasant day ahead. The manor grounds showed signs of renewed activity, people emerging from their sheltered spaces to resume normal routines. At the workshop, he found everything as he had left it. The banked coals still held faint heat, making fire building easier. He added kindling and blew gently, coaxing flames to life. The cat appeared from wherever it had sheltered during the rain, looking somewhat bedraggled but unharmed. It immediately began grooming itself with determined focus, restoring dignity to its damp fur. Oswald opened the door wide to admit fresh air and sunlight. The workshop needed drying after yesterday's humidity. He positioned the ash shafts where morning light would reach them, encouraging any remaining moisture to evaporate. Wood and sun maintained their own relationship, one that he had learned to facilitate rather than control. Patience allowed natural processes to achieve what force could not. While the shafts dried, he decided to work on tasks requiring less environmental concern. The pile of prepared fletchings from yesterday needed sorting and organization. Some were suitable for hunting arrows, their size and shape ideal for stability. Others would serve better on standard practice arrows. A few showed minor imperfections that made them appropriate only for training arrows used by younger guards still learning their craft. He created separate bundles, tying each with light thread to keep them organized. This sorting saved time during actual fletching work. Having the right materials immediately available prevented interruption and maintained workflow. His observant nature appreciated such organization. Small efficiencies accumulated into significant time savings over weeks and months. By mid-morning, the ash shafts felt properly dry to his touch. He brought one to the bench and examined it closely. The wood had weathered yesterday's dampness without issue, maintaining its straightness and structural integrity. He secured it in the vise and reached for his smoothing leather, ready to begin the final surface preparation. The leather scraped across the wood in small circular motions, removing the last tiny imperfections left by the plane. This stage required different attention than earlier shaping, not removing significant material but polishing what remained. The shaft grew smoother with each pass, its surface taking on a subtle sheen. His work-reddened hands moved steadily, following patterns established through thousands of previous arrows. Sunlight strengthened as morning progressed toward midday. The workshop grew pleasantly warm, no longer requiring the fire for comfort, though it continued burning for practical purposes. Through the open doorway, Oswald could see the harvest field. Workers had returned to gather the remaining cut grain, moving carefully across ground softened by rain. Their voices carried across the distance, indistinct but companionable. He completed the first shaft's smoothing and began on the second. The leather whispered against wood, a sound so soft it barely registered above the ambient noise of the day. His humming accompanied the work, plain chant melodies rising and falling in their timeless patterns. The cat had finished grooming and now dozed in a patch of sunlight, its fur dry and properly arranged once more. The repetitive nature of the work allowed his mind to wander pleasantly. He thought about the bowl he was carving, considering what design might decorate its exterior. Perhaps a simple band of carved lines, or maybe leaves to honor the apple tree that had provided the wood. Such decisions need not be made immediately. The bowl's completion remained distant, and inspiration might arrive as the work progressed. 3 shafts received their final smoothing before the prime bells rang. Oswald set aside his leather and stretched, working out the stiffness that accumulated from maintaining the same position. His shoulders rolled, his back extended, his fingers flexed. The body required these small attentions, especially as years accumulated. He accepted this without resentment. Aging was natural, and his body still served him well despite its 41 years. He stepped outside to take his midday meal in the sunshine. Today he had fresh bread from the morning's baking, still slightly warm. Cheese and apples completed the simple fare. He ate slowly, savoring the bread's warmth and the cheese's sharp flavor. The apple was crisp, its juice sweet and refreshing. Around him, the manor's midday activities continued, people moving between tasks, animals wandering, life proceeding according to its established patterns. The harvest crew had taken their own break, gathering in the field's shade. Their laughter occasionally rose above the general murmur of voices. The work was nearly complete now, just a small section remaining. By day's end, the entire field would be clear, the grain safely stored for winter. Then attention would turn to other seasonal tasks, preparing equipment for storage, maintaining buildings before cold weather arrived, organizing supplies. After eating, Oswald allowed himself to simply sit in the sun's warmth. His eyes closed against the brightness. The light pressed against his eyelids, creating patterns of red and gold. Sounds reached him without demanding interpretation. Birds, voices, distant hammering, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze. He existed in pure sensation, thought suspended in favor of simple awareness. When he opened his eyes again, the sun had moved perceptibly across the sky. Perhaps a quarter hour had passed, perhaps more. Time held different qualities depending on one's state of mind. During focused work, hours vanished like moments. During rest, moments could expand into small eternities. Both experiences had value, both served their purpose in the rhythm of days. He rose and returned to the workshop, ready to continue the afternoon's labor. The remaining 5 shafts needed smoothing, then all 8 would be ready for fletching. He worked through them methodically, one after another, maintaining the same careful attention for the last as he had given the first. Consistency defined quality in arrow making. Every shaft deserved equal care. The afternoon unfolded in pleasant productivity. Leather scraped against wood. Shafts grew smooth beneath his patient attention. Sunlight moved across the workshop floor, marking time's passage without urgency. The cat woke, stretched, investigated various corners, and settled back into sleep in a new location. Everything proceeded in its natural order, one task flowing into the next. By the time none bells rang, all 8 shafts stood complete in their initial preparation. Tomorrow he would begin fletching them, transforming these smooth wooden cylinders into functional arrows. But that work belonged to tomorrow. Today's tasks were finished, accomplished with thorough care and without rush. Oswald began gathering materials for tomorrow's fletching work, selecting appropriate feathers from his sorted bundles, ensuring adequate thread and beeswax, checking that all tools were properly positioned. This preparation was itself a kind of work, requiring thought and planning. Beginning each day with materials ready prevented wasted time and maintained smooth workflow. The sun was lowering toward evening when he heard footsteps approaching the workshop. He looked up to see his nephew, the boy he had begun teaching last spring. The lad was 10 years old, with curious eyes and hands already showing the calluses of regular work. He came several times a week when his other duties at the manor allowed, eager to learn the Fletcher's craft. "Good evening, Uncle," the boy said, using the title of respect rather than blood relation. "Mother said I might come if you had work for me." Oswald smiled his slight smile, pleased by the visit. "I have work indeed. Come, I will show you how to prepare thread for fletching." The boy entered eagerly and took his place on a smaller stool kept for his visits. Oswald demonstrated the process, running thread through beeswax, coating it thoroughly, ensuring even coverage. The boy watched with focused attention, his young face serious with concentration. Then he tried it himself, his movements careful if not yet fluid. "Like this?" he asked, holding up the waxed thread. "Very good," Oswald confirmed. "Now do 20 more lengths. Take your time, thoroughness matters more than speed." The boy set to work while Oswald continued his own tasks nearby. They worked in companionable silence, broken occasionally by questions from the nephew or gentle corrections from Oswald. The boy's humming began after a while, mimicking the plain chant melodies he had heard his uncle use. The sound was less assured but no less sincere. Teaching brought its own satisfactions, Oswald reflected. Watching skill develop in young hands, seeing understanding dawn in young eyes, these rewarded in ways that completed arrows could not. The craft would continue beyond his own years because he took time to share knowledge. This continuity mattered, connecting past to future through the medium of present instruction. By the time the boy had prepared his 20 thread lengths, The sun was setting. Golden light slanted through the doorway at a sharp angle, painting everything in warm tones. Oswald inspected the threads, found them acceptable, and praised the boy's diligence. The child beamed at this approval, his pleasure evident in his expression. "Will you teach me fletching next time?" he asked hopefully. "Perhaps," Oswald replied. "First you must master thread preparation completely. We will see." The boy accepted this without complaint, understanding that learning followed its own pace. He helped Oswald with the evening closing tasks, sweeping shavings, organizing materials, ensuring everything sat in proper order. When finished, he bid his uncle good evening and departed toward his family's quarters, walking with the particular pride of a child who has worked alongside adults. Oswald watched him go, feeling the deep contentment that had always defined his emotional baseline. The day had been good, productive work, pleasant weather, time with his nephew. Nothing extraordinary, yet entirely satisfying in its ordinary completeness. He secured the workshop and made his way to his cottage as twilight deepened around him. The evening routine unfolded as always. Fire built, meal prepared, hunger satisfied. He ate his pottage while considering tomorrow's tasks, fletching those 8 arrows, perhaps beginning work on more standard shafts if time allowed. The work never truly ended, merely paused between days. This continuity pleased rather than burdened him. Purpose came from having meaningful labor that required his particular skills. After eating, he worked on his apple wood bowl, carving away small amounts of material. The interior deepened fractionally with each session. At this pace, the bowl would take months to complete, but time was something he possessed in adequate measure. Rushing would only risk mistakes. Better to proceed gradually, allowing the work to reveal itself at its own pace. The fire burned lower as evening progressed toward night. Oswald set aside the bowl when his hands grew tired. His bed waited with its familiar comfort: straw mattress, wool blankets. The accumulated warmth of the day still held in the cottage's thick walls. He settled into sleep's approach with the ease of one whose days brought natural tiredness. Outside, stars emerged in a clear sky finally freed from clouds. The manor settled into nighttime quiet, most inhabitants already abed. In the workshop, prepared shafts waited for tomorrow's fletching. Materials sat organized and ready. Tools hung in their proper places. Everything rested in the darkness, suspended between completed work and labor yet to come. Oswald's breathing slowed and deepened as sleep claimed him. His body released the day's accumulated efforts, muscles relaxing completely. Thoughts fragmented into sensory impressions: the feel of smooth wood, the sound of his nephew's uncertain humming, the taste of warm bread, the sight of sunlight on wet ground. Memory and sensation blended as consciousness faded into rest. The night held him gently, as it held all creatures finding peace in darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks and satisfactions, but tonight offered only stillness, and in that stillness the Fletcher found his rest, deep, peaceful, and complete. The next morning arrived with a crispness that announced autumn's firm establishment. Oswald woke to find frost covering the ground outside his window, each blade of grass outlined in white crystal. The sight pleased him. This first frost marked a clear transition, nature declaring one season finished and another begun. He dressed in his warmest clothing, knowing the workshop would take longer to heat on such a morning. Outside, his breath formed visible clouds in the cold air. The puddles from 2 days prior had frozen overnight, their surfaces reflecting the pale sky. He walked carefully across the slippery ground, his feet finding purchase through long familiarity with the path. At the well, a thin layer of ice had formed across the water's surface. He broke through it with the bucket, drawing up water that was shockingly cold against his hands. The workshop felt particularly chill when he entered. The cat sat near where the hearth would soon provide warmth, looking patient and expectant. Oswald smiled at this optimism and set about building the fire with extra care. More kindling than usual, larger pieces of wood added once flames established themselves. The fire grew steadily, beginning its work of driving cold from the space. While the workshop warmed, he examined the 8 ash shafts prepared for fletching. The cold had made the wood slightly more brittle to the touch, though not enough to cause concern. He positioned them near the hearth where gentle warmth would bring them to a more workable state. Wood responded to temperature, and understanding these responses was part of the Fletcher's craft. He prepared his materials while waiting, thread already waxed from his nephew's efforts yesterday, feathers sorted and ready, beeswax positioned within easy reach. Everything sat organized on the bench in the order he would need it. This preparation ritual had become as much a part of the work as the fletching itself, a necessary prelude that shaped the quality of what followed. By the time the workshop reached comfortable temperature, the shafts had warmed sufficiently. Oswald selected the first and marked its 3 fletching positions with light charcoal lines. His movements were unhurried, each action deliberate. The first arrow of any batch often set the rhythm for those that followed. Starting well meant continuing well. He positioned the first fletching against the shaft, took up the prepared thread and began wrapping. The thread passed over and around, creating the spiral binding that would secure feather to wood. His humming commenced, plain chant melodies filling the space with their modal patterns. The cat had moved into its preferred spot and lay watching him with half-closed eyes, content in the warmth. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt as the sun climbed higher. Droplets formed on the workshop's eaves, falling with irregular rhythm. The sound created counterpoint to his humming, nature and human both contributing to the morning's music. Oswald's hands moved steadily, binding the first fletching, then the second, then the third. The arrow took shape beneath his patient attention. When the first arrow was complete, he set it carefully in the drying rack and reached for the next shaft. The process repeated: mark positions, place fletching, wrap thread, secure binding. His work-reddened hands knew these motions so thoroughly that consciousness was unnecessary. The body held knowledge that the mind need not direct, wisdom stored in muscle and nerve through decades of repetition. The second arrow joined the first, then the third. Morning progressed through its gradual warming, frost disappearing from all but the most shadowed areas. Through the doorway, Oswald could see servants moving about their duties, their movements brisk in the cold air. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, carrying the scent of wood fires and cooking food. He continued his work without pause, finding satisfaction in the rhythm. Each arrow received the same careful attention, no variation in quality from first to last. This consistency was a point of pride, evidence of skill maintained through unwavering focus. Some craftsmen grew careless as tasks progressed, their attention wandering. Oswald had trained himself against such tendencies. Every arrow mattered equally. By the time sexed bells rang at midday, 6 arrows stood complete. 2 remained. His hands ached pleasantly from the morning's sustained effort. He set down his thread and flexed his fingers, working out the stiffness. The workshop had grown quite warm now, the fire's heat accumulating in the enclosed space. He opened the door wider to admit fresh air, creating balance between warmth and ventilation. His midday meal today included a surprise, a small meat pie from the manor kitchen, payment for arrows delivered earlier in the week. The pie was still warm, its crust flaky and golden. He ate it slowly, savoring the rich filling of pork and herbs. Bread and cheese completed the meal, along with small beer to wash it down. The food was simple but satisfying, fuel for the afternoon's continued labor. He ate outside despite the lingering chill, enjoying the clear air and bright sunshine. The harvest field lay empty now, all grain safely stored. The workers had moved on to other tasks, repairing fences, preparing equipment for winter storage, organizing the manor's various operations. Autumn brought its own rhythms of work, different from summer's growing season or spring's planting urgency. After eating, Oswald walked a short distance from the workshop to stretch his legs and rest his eyes. Movement felt good after the morning's stationary work. He walked past the manor's outbuildings, greeting those he encountered with nods and brief words. The blacksmith was at his forge, hammer ringing against heated metal. The baker's oven released waves of warmth and the scent of fresh bread. Life at the manor continued its daily patterns, each person contributing their particular skills. He returned to find the cat had claimed his stool, curled into a tight ball of contentment. Rather than disturb the animal, Oswald remained standing to complete the final 2 arrows. His body appreciated the different position, distributing effort through different muscles. Standing allowed his back to remain straight, his shoulders to move more freely. The 7th arrow received its fletchings with the same care as the first. Thread wrapped smoothly, bindings held secure, feathers positioned perfectly. He examined his work from multiple angles, checking for any imperfection. Finding none, he set it in the rack and took up the final shaft of the batch. This last arrow seemed to demand particular attention, as if requesting that he finish the work as strongly as he had begun it. He obliged this feeling, real or imagined, by working with extra deliberation. Each wrap of thread received conscious focus. Each fletching was positioned with precise care. When complete, the arrow stood as a testament to maintained quality, the 8th as good as the first. Oswald held the finished arrow, feeling its weight and balance. It satisfied him completely. These 8 would serve the guards well, flying true to their targets whether in practice or need. Good arrows made capable archers more effective. His work, though removed from direct action, contributed to the manor's security and efficiency. This knowledge brought quiet pride. The afternoon was not yet spent. He He decided to begin preparation on another batch of shafts, maintaining the constant progression of work through its various stages. From his seasoned timber stores, he selected ash again, a reliable choice for standard arrows. He pulled down a dozen shafts and examined each one, setting aside any that showed problematic grain patterns or hidden flaws. 10 shafts passed inspection. He arranged these on his bench and began the initial roughing work with his drawknife. The blade bit into wood, removing material in smooth curls. The familiar rhythm established itself: pull, check, pull, check. His humming resumed, weaving through the space alongside the sounds of his work. The cat had finally vacated his stool, so he reclaimed it, settling into its familiar contours. Wood shavings accumulated around his feet in pale drifts. The workshop smelled strongly of fresh-cut timber, a scent he had loved since boyhood. There was honesty in that smell, evidence of transformation. Tree becoming arrow, raw material becoming finished product. His hands facilitated this change, guided it, but did not force it. Good craftsmanship worked with material rather than against it. The afternoon light began its gradual shift toward evening. Shadows lengthened across the workshop floor. The fire had burned down to coals, requiring fresh wood to maintain its heat. Oswald added logs from his pile, positioning them carefully to encourage good burning. Flames grew around the new fuel, crackling and popping as sap pockets heated and burst. By the time none bells rang, 4 shafts had received their initial shaping. 6 remained for tomorrow's attention. Oswald felt satisfied with the day's progress. 8 arrows completed and fletched, 4 new shafts roughed out, materials organized for continued work. Steady effort yielded steady results. This principle had guided his work life for decades and had never failed him. He began his evening closing routine as twilight approached. Tools cleaned and stored, work surfaces swept clear, fire banked for the night. The completed arrows needed careful handling. He transferred them to their protective barrel, cushioning them with straw to prevent damage during storage. Each arrow represented hours of careful work and deserved proper treatment. The walk to his cottage traversed ground that had thawed completely during the day but would freeze again overnight. The temperature was already dropping as the sun descended. His breath formed clouds again, visible in the dimming light. Stars were beginning to emerge overhead, bright pinpoints in the darkening sky. The evening air carried the mixed scents of wood smoke and approaching winter. At the cottage, he built his fire and prepared his evening meal. Tonight the pottage had been enriched with vegetables from the manor's root cellar, turnips and onions, their flavors mellowed by long simmering. He ate with good appetite, sopping up the thick stew with bread. The warmth of the food spread through his body, countering the day's accumulated chill. After eating, he settled near the fire with his apple wood bowl. The carving was progressing well. The interior had achieved good depth, and the walls maintained even thickness. Tonight he began considering the exterior decoration. He traced potential patterns with his finger, visualizing how carved lines might follow the bowl's curve. The decision could wait, but thinking about it was itself pleasurable. His knife moved in small, careful cuts, removing tiny chips from the bowl's interior. Each cut deepened the hollow fractionally. At this pace, Perhaps another month would see the bowl completed. Then it would require oiling and finishing, processes that demanded their own time and attention. The entire project from beginning to end would span several months, but this extended time frame was part of the work's appeal. Not everything needed to be rushed toward completion. The fire burned steadily, filling the cottage with warmth and flickering light. Outside, full darkness had arrived. The manor settled into nighttime quiet, its inhabitants seeking rest after the day's labors. Somewhere a dog barked briefly, then fell silent. An owl called from the nearby woods, hunting in the darkness. Life continued its nocturnal patterns while humans slept. Oswald worked on the bowl until his hands tired and his eyes began to strain in the firelight. Setting it aside, he prepared for bed. The cottage had accumulated good warmth from the fire, making the space cozy despite the cold night beyond its walls. He removed his outer layers and settled into his bed, pulling the wool blankets close around his body. His thoughts drifted pleasantly as sleep approached. The day had been productive and satisfying. Tomorrow would bring similar work, more shafts to shape, perhaps beginning fletching on another batch if time allowed. His nephew might visit again, eager to continue learning. The endless cycle of work would continue, each day adding to the accumulated total of arrows created over the years. How many arrows had he made in his time as Fletcher? Thousands certainly, perhaps tens of thousands. Each one had passed through his hands, received his attention, carried his mark of quality. They had flown to targets, brought down game, served in practice and in need. His work extended beyond the workshop's walls, touching lives and situations he would never witness. This invisible impact satisfied him more than visible recognition ever could. Sleep came gently, consciousness fading into rest without clear boundary. His breathing deepened and slowed. His muscles released their day's accumulated tension. The cottage grew quieter, darker, stiller. In the workshop, tools hung ready for tomorrow's use. Completed arrows waited for delivery. Roughed shafts anticipated continued shaping. Everything rested in its proper place, held in the darkness between one day and the next. The night deepened around Oswald's cottage. Frost formed again on the ground outside, crystals growing in delicate patterns. The stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient courses. And in his bed, Oswald, 41 years old, with work-reddened hands and graying red beard, slept the profound sleep of one whose days brought purpose and whose labor brought meaning. His rest was complete, his peace undisturbed, his contentment absolute. The following days settled into a rhythm as reliable as the changing seasons themselves. Each morning Oswald woke with the dawn, dressed in layers against the growing cold, and made his way to the workshop. Each evening he completed his tasks, secured his space, and returned to the cottage for simple meals and quiet rest. The work progressed steadily. Shafts shaped, arrows fletched, repairs completed, materials organized. The frost that had visited once became a regular occurrence. Each morning the ground wore its white coating, and each afternoon the sun reclaimed the moisture. The cycle repeated with dependable regularity. Trees around the manor began their autumn transformation, leaves shifting from green to gold, from gold to rust, from rust to brown. Some had already begun falling, collecting in drifts against buildings and fences. Oswald's nephew came 3 times during the week, his visits becoming more regular as his other duties at the manor allowed. The boy's skill with thread preparation had improved noticeably. His hands moved with greater confidence now, coating the linen evenly with beeswax. Oswald began teaching him the next step, how to position a fletching against a shaft, how to hold it steady while beginning the first wraps of thread. The boy struggled initially, his young fingers not yet possessing the strength to maintain proper tension. The thread would slip, or the feather would shift position, but he persevered without complaint, trying again each time something went wrong. Oswald watched this persistence with approval. Skill came through repeated effort, through failure and correction. The boy understood this instinctively, accepting difficulty as part of learning rather than evidence of inadequacy. "Your hands will strengthen," Oswald told him during one session. "Mine were weak once too. Time and work build what you need." The boy nodded, examining his palms where faint calluses were beginning to form. "How long did it take you to learn fletching?" "Months before I could do it properly," Oswald replied honestly. "Years before I could do it well. Decades before I stopped thinking about each step." He paused, then added, "Even now, I sometimes discover small improvements. Learning never truly ends." This seemed to comfort the boy, knowing that his uncle's mastery had required patient accumulation. He returned to his practice with renewed focus, wrapping thread around shaft and feather with determined concentration. The result was imperfect but showed improvement from his previous attempt. Oswald praised the progress, and the boy's face brightened with pleasure at the recognition. The manor's rhythm shifted as autumn progressed. Harvest complete, attention turned to preservation and preparation. In the kitchen, servants dried herbs and stored root vegetables. In the smokehouse, meat underwent its transformation through salt and smoke. In the barns, animals were brought in from distant pastures to quarters closer to the manor buildings. Everything drew inward, consolidating against winter's approaching demands. Oswald's work continued without seasonal interruption. Arrows were needed regardless of weather. If anything, winter increased demand. The guards required more arrows for practice during long indoor hours, and hunters pursued game while it remained available. He maintained his steady production, completing batches and beginning new ones in endless succession. One morning brought an unexpected visitor. The manor's steward appeared at the workshop door, a man Oswald knew by sight and reputation, but rarely spoke with directly. The steward was responsible for all practical operations of the manor, a position requiring both organizational skill and diplomatic ability. His presence suggested some matter requiring attention. "Good morning," the steward said, his tone courteous. "I hope I am not interrupting important work." "Good morning," Oswald replied, setting down his drawknife. "I am always at your service. What brings you to the workshop?" "The Lord will be hosting guests in 3 weeks," the steward explained. "Important visitors from the neighboring estates. There will be a hunt, and he wishes to present each guest with a gift of fine arrows. 12 sets, each containing 6 arrows of superior quality." He paused, then added, "I understand this is considerable work on short notice." Oswald considered the request. 72 arrows total, each needing to be exceptional rather than merely adequate. The timeline was tight but not impossible. "It can be done," he said. "I will need to select the finest materials, perfect shafts, the best feathers, exceptional bindings. Whatever you require, let me know and I will ensure you receive it," the steward assured him. The Lord particularly emphasized that these arrows should reflect the manner's quality and attention to craft. "They will," Oswald confirmed. His tone carried quiet confidence rather than boastfulness. He knew his capabilities, understood what excellence required, and trusted his ability to deliver it. "I will begin today." The steward thanked him and departed, leaving Oswald to contemplate the task. Special orders brought their own satisfaction. They demanded his highest skill and provided opportunity to demonstrate full mastery. But they also required careful planning and sustained focus. He would need to adjust his usual workflow to accommodate this deadline while maintaining his regular production. He spent the remainder of the morning selecting materials. From his timber stores, he chose only the straightest ash shafts, examining each one with extra scrutiny. Grain patterns needed to be perfect, with no hidden flaws or weak points. Color should be uniform, the pale wood showing consistent tone throughout. He set aside 18 shafts that met these demanding standards, giving himself extras in case any developed problems during shaping. The feathers required similar careful selection. He went through his entire collection, choosing only the largest, most perfectly formed specimens. These would become the arrow's visual signature, their quality immediately apparent to anyone who handled them. He selected goose feathers of exceptional size, their white color pristine, their barbs perfectly interlocked. Thread for these special arrows needed to be finer than usual, creating bindings that were both strong and visually elegant. He had a supply of particularly fine linen thread, saved for such occasions. The beeswax would be the same, but he would apply it with extra care, ensuring smooth consistency throughout. By midday, his materials were assembled and organized. The task ahead was clear: 72 arrows of exceptional quality, completed within 3 weeks. He felt no anxiety about this deadline, only a calm sense of purpose. The work would require sustained effort and careful attention, but both were available to him in adequate measure. He began that afternoon with the first batch of shafts. The drawknife moved across wood with particular deliberation, each stroke considered and controlled. These arrows would be examined by people accustomed to quality, perhaps even compared to arrows from other estates. Every detail mattered. The shafts needed to be not just straight but perfectly straight, not just smooth but perfectly smooth. His humming accompanied the work, but today the melodies seemed to acquire additional focus, as if the plainchant itself recognized the importance of the task. The cat dozed in its usual spot, unbothered by any sense of special purpose. To the animal, this day was like any other: warmth, food, and peaceful rest. Oswald envied such simplicity even as he embraced his own more complicated relationship with his craft. The afternoon progressed through its familiar stages. Light shifted across the workshop floor. The fire required periodic attention. Outside sounds marked the manor's activities, but Oswald remained focused on the wood beneath his hands, shaping it with patient precision. Each shaft slowly revealed its final form, transforming from rough timber into refined arrow component. By evening, 6 shafts had received their initial shaping. 12 days remained before the deadline, and he had completed 6 of 72 arrows worth of shaping. The mathematics were straightforward. He needed to maintain this pace while also continuing his regular work. It would require longer hours and fewer breaks, but nothing beyond his capacity. At the cottage that evening, he ate his meal while mentally reviewing his plan. Tomorrow he would complete the shaping on these 6 shafts and begin 6 more. The following day, smoothing would commence on the first batch. Fletching would follow. Each stage required its specific time, and all needed to flow smoothly from one to the next. Organization would be as important as skill. After eating, he brought out his apple wood bowl but found himself too distracted to work on it effectively. His mind remained occupied with arrow calculations, materials needed, time required, quality standards to maintain. The bowl could wait. These 3 weeks would be devoted primarily to the special order, with other activities reduced to minimum necessary levels. He set the bowl aside and simply sat near the fire, allowing his body to rest even as his mind continued planning. Tomorrow would begin the sustained effort in earnest. Tonight, he needed good sleep to prepare for the work ahead. He went to bed earlier than usual, settling into the straw mattress with conscious intention to rest deeply. Sleep came readily enough, though his dreams were filled with images of arrows, shafts being shaped, feathers being bound, finished arrows standing in proud ranks. Even in sleep, his craftsman's mind continued its work, processing challenges and solutions. When he woke the next morning, he felt ready. The task ahead was clear, the path forward mapped. All that remained was the doing. He rose before full dawn, dressed quickly, and made his way to the workshop in the pre-morning darkness. Stars still shone overhead, though the eastern sky showed the first hints of coming light. The cold bit sharply, but he barely noticed. His attention had already moved ahead to the day's work, to the shafts waiting for his hands, to the arrows that would emerge from sustained effort and careful attention. At the workshop, he built the fire larger than usual. Today would be long, and warmth would help maintain focus. The cat appeared from somewhere, materializing as it always did, and took its customary position. Oswald smiled slightly at this constancy. Whatever challenges he faced, the cat's routine remained undisturbed. There was wisdom in such consistency, a reminder that some things remained steady regardless of external demands. Light grew gradually, filling the workshop with pale illumination. Oswald arranged his materials, checked his tools, and positioned the first shaft in his vise. His hands settled onto the drawknife's worn handles. He drew breath, released it slowly, and made the first stroke. Wood curled away from the blade. The work had begun. Outside, the manor was stirring to life. Servants emerged from their quarters, beginning their daily tasks. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Animals in the barns called for feeding. The day's activities commenced according to their usual patterns. But in the workshop, Oswald had entered a different rhythm, one measured not by hours but by arrows, not by the sun's position, but by the gradual transformation of wood into something both functional and beautiful. His humming filled the space, plain chant melodies rising and falling. The drawknife moved steadily across wood. Shavings accumulated in pale drifts around his feet, and slowly, carefully, patiently, the arrows began their journey toward existence, one stroke at a time, one shaft at a time, one day at a time, until they would stand complete and ready, carrying in their craftsmanship the mark of sustained devotion to excellence. The days that followed merged into a singular flow of concentrated effort. Oswald rose each morning before dawn and worked until darkness made continuing impossible. The special order consumed most of his attention, though he maintained minimum production of standard arrows to fulfill regular obligations. Time became measured in completed tasks rather than hours. 6 shafts shaped, 4 smoothed, 3 fletched. Progress accumulated through steady application. His nephew's visits continued, though Oswald had less time for extended instruction. The boy understood without needing explanation. He arrived, prepared thread in silence, organized materials, and departed with minimal conversation. His help, though modest, freed Oswald to focus on the demanding work. The child seemed to grasp that this period required different rhythms, and he adapted without complaint. By the end of the first week, 18 arrows stood complete, a quarter of the total needed. Oswald examined them critically, finding no flaws that his experienced eye could detect. The shafts were uniformly straight, their surfaces polished to subtle sheen. The fletchings sat at perfect intervals, bound with thread so fine and tight it seemed almost to disappear. These arrows would fly true and look exceptional doing so. The second week brought challenges. A shaft split during shaping, despite appearing perfect during selection. Wood could be unpredictable, hidden weaknesses revealing themselves only under stress. Oswald set the damaged piece aside for eventual use in standard arrows and selected a replacement from his reserves. The setback cost half a day but taught nothing new. Such occurrences were part of the craft, to be accepted rather than mourned. His hands began showing signs of the sustained effort. Calluses that had been worn smooth over years of regular work now thickened again under the increased demands. His fingers ached at day's end, stiff from maintaining consistent tension during fletching. Each evening he soaked them in warm water mixed with herbs the manor's healer had provided, chamomile and lavender, their scents rising in soothing steam. The treatment helped, allowing him to begin each new day with adequate flexibility. The weather shifted during the second week. Cold rain arrived, lasting 2 full days. The workshop became damp despite the fire, and wood absorbed moisture from the heavy air. Oswald adjusted by working closer to the hearth, allowing heat to drive dampness from materials before using them. The rain's steady drumming on the roof created backdrop to his work, its rhythm matching the repetitive nature of his tasks. During these wet days, he thought about the guests who would receive these arrows. What were their lives like? Did they appreciate fine craftsmanship, or would these arrows be merely expensive gifts, their quality unrecognized? He hoped they would understand what they held, not just arrows but hours of careful work, years of accumulated skill, a lifetime's devotion to craft. But whether they understood or not, the arrows would be excellent. That was the standard he set for himself, regardless of who might eventually use them. The cat provided companionship through the long working hours. It had settled into extended periods of sleep, occasionally rousing to groom itself or investigate sounds outside. Sometimes it would approach Oswald and sit nearby, watching his hands move through their practiced motions. The animal's presence, though silent, offered a kind of comfort. Another living being sharing the space, undemanding but aware. By the middle of the second week, 36 arrows stood complete, exactly half the required total. The remaining time would be adequate if nothing else went wrong and he maintained his current pace. Oswald felt cautious confidence rather than certainty. Much could still happen. Tools could break, materials could fail, his own body could falter. He simply continued working, trusting that steady effort would likely prove sufficient. His nephew arrived one afternoon with unexpected news. "Uncle," the boy said, excitement evident in his voice, "the steward says you are making the finest arrows anyone has seen. The Lord himself came to inquire about them." Oswald smiled slightly at this enthusiasm. "The arrows are good," he agreed. "Whether they are the finest anyone has seen, I cannot say, but they meet my standards, which is what matters." "May I see them?" the boy asked. Oswald gestured toward the barrel where completed arrows were stored. The nephew approached carefully and lifted out one arrow, handling it with obvious reverence. He examined the fletching, sighted down the shaft, tested the balance. His young face showed genuine appreciation for the quality before him. "They are beautiful," he said softly. "They are functional," Oswald corrected gently. "Beauty in arrows comes from how well they serve their purpose. These will fly straight and strike true. That makes them beautiful, if beauty is the right word." The boy nodded, absorbing this lesson. He replaced the arrow with careful attention and returned to his usual tasks, but something in his demeanor had shifted. He worked with additional focus now, as if understanding more fully what the craft could achieve when pursued with devotion. Oswald noted this change with quiet satisfaction. Teaching happened through demonstration as much as instruction. The third week began with clear, cold weather. Frost covered everything each morning, and the sun's warmth no longer fully dispelled it during the day. Winter was asserting itself gradually but unmistakably. The workshop required larger fires to maintain comfortable temperature. Oswald's breath formed clouds even inside, visible in the cold air until the fire's heat accumulated. 48 arrows complete, 24 remaining, 9 days until the guest's arrival. The mathematics remained favorable, but Oswald increased his hours slightly, beginning earlier and continuing later. The final batch needed to match the quality of the first, and fatigue could compromise attention. He ate more to fuel the extended effort, and slept whenever possible to maintain recovery. His hands protested the sustained demands. Despite the herbal soaks, his fingers grew increasingly stiff. The smallest joints ached constantly, and gripping tools required conscious effort rather than automatic response. But he worked through the discomfort, maintaining his standards. Pain was temporary. The arrows would endure for years. The choice was clear. During this final week, the manor's preparations for the guests became visible. Servants cleaned buildings with extra thoroughness. The kitchen increased its activities, exotic scents drifting from its windows. In the great hall, tapestries were hung and tables polished. Everything was being readied for the important visitors. Oswald's arrows were one component of a much larger effort. He found this perspective helpful. His work mattered, but it existed within a broader context. Many people contributed their skills to create the manor's hospitality. The baker made fine breads, the cook prepared elaborate meals, the stable master ensured horses were perfectly groomed. Each person brought expertise to their assigned task. Together, they created something larger than any individual contribution. 60 arrows complete, 12 remaining, 5 days until the deadline. Oswald felt the end approaching, that particular sensation when a large task nears completion. Part of him wanted to rush toward finish, to see the work done and feel relief. But he resisted this urge, maintaining his careful pace. The final arrows deserved the same attention as the first. His nephew arrived and worked in companionable silence, sensing perhaps that these last days required maximum focus. The boy prepared thread, organized materials, swept shavings, and performed small tasks that freed Oswald's time. His help, given without expectation of recognition, exemplified the proper apprentice spirit. Oswald made note to tell the boy's mother of his valuable assistance. 66 arrows complete, 6 remaining, 3 days remaining. The shafts for these final arrows were already shaped and smoothed, waiting only for fletching. Tomorrow would see 4 completed if all went well. The following day would finish the last 2 and allow time for final inspection of the entire set. The timeline would hold. That evening, Oswald's hands trembled slightly as he ate his meal. Fatigue had accumulated despite his best efforts, but the end was near, and he could rest once the task was done. He soaked his hands longer than usual, adding extra herbs to the water. The warmth penetrated deeply, easing the ache in his joints. Tomorrow required steady hands for fletching. He would give them this night to recover as much as possible. Sleep came heavily, his body claiming the rest it needed. He dreamed again of arrows, but now they were flying rather than being made. Long arcs through clear air, perfect flights ending in solid impacts. The dreams were not troubled but peaceful, as if his unconscious mind was anticipating successful completion. Morning arrived gray and cold. Oswald woke feeling somewhat restored. His hands still ached but functioned adequately. He dressed, ate quickly, and went to the workshop while dawn was still just a promise in the eastern sky. The final push had arrived. Today would see 4 more arrows completed. Tomorrow, the last 2 and final inspection. He built the fire and prepared his materials with extra care. These final arrows needed to match the 66 already finished. Consistency across the entire set was essential. He examined the prepared shafts one final time, confirming their quality. Then he selected the first fletching, positioned it carefully, and took up his thread. The morning flowed into afternoon, afternoon into evening. 4 arrows received their fletchings, each one crafted with sustained attention despite his fatigue. When the 4th was complete and placed in the drying rack, Oswald sat back with deep satisfaction. 2 remained. Tomorrow they would be finished, and the task would be complete. He performed his evening closing routine with additional thoroughness, ensuring everything was positioned perfectly for tomorrow's final work. The workshop had served him well during these 3 weeks of sustained effort. It deserved acknowledgement, if only in his own mind. The space had been steady and reliable, providing shelter and warmth while he pursued excellence. At the cottage, he ate his meal slowly, feeling the accumulated fatigue in his entire body. But beneath the tiredness lay satisfaction. The work was nearly done, and it was good work. Tomorrow would bring completion and the particular relief that came with fulfilling a demanding obligation. Tonight brought rest earned through sustained effort. He went to bed early, knowing tomorrow required his best remaining energy. His hands throbbed despite the herbal soak, but he accepted this discomfort as the price of accomplishment. In the workshop, 68 arrows waited in their barrel. 2 shafts sat ready for their final transformation. And in his bed, Oswald, 41 years old, with work-reddened hands and graying red beard, found sleep quickly, his body claiming the rest it had earned through dedication to craft pursued with unwavering devotion. The final morning arrived with a sense of quiet ceremony. Oswald woke feeling the accumulated weight of 3 weeks' sustained effort, but also the anticipation of completion. Today would see the last 2 arrows finished and the entire set ready for delivery. He dressed carefully, as if the day itself deserved particular respect, and made his way to the workshop through air so cold it seemed to crystallize in his lungs. The workshop greeted him with familiar silence. He built the fire methodically, watching flames grow and strengthen until warmth began filling the space. The cat appeared and took its position, understanding perhaps that today held significance. Oswald arranged his materials with extra deliberation. The 2 remaining shafts, the finest fletchings reserved specifically for these final arrows, thread prepared to perfect consistency, beeswax positioned exactly where needed. He stood for a moment before beginning, simply breathing and centering himself. 3 weeks of work would culminate in these final 2 arrows. They needed to equal all that had come before, maintaining the set's consistency while carrying the particular weight of completion. His work-reddened hands flexed once, twice, releasing stiffness. Then he took up the first shaft and positioned it on the bench. The morning light strengthened gradually as he worked. His humming began, plain chant melodies filling the workshop with their modal patterns. The first fletching was positioned with exquisite care. Thread wrapped around shaft and feather in perfect spirals. His hands moved with the assurance of 41 years and decades of accumulated skill, every motion precise despite the fatigue beneath. The first of the final 2 arrows took shape beneath his patient attention. Each wrap of thread received conscious focus. Each adjustment of the fletching was made with deliberate care. When the 3rd fletching was secured and the binding completed, he held the arrow and examined it from every angle. It satisfied him completely, worthy of standing alongside the other 69. 1 remained. He set the completed arrow in the drying rack and took up the final shaft. This last arrow seemed to carry particular significance, as if it would define the entire set's character. Oswald acknowledged this feeling without being ruled by it. The arrow would be crafted with the same care as all the others, no more and no less. Consistency was its own form of excellence. The 2nd fletching was positioned and secured. Then the 3rd. His hands worked steadily, maintaining the rhythm that had carried him through 3 weeks of focused labor. The thread wrapped smoothly, the beeswax held everything firmly, the feathers sat at perfect intervals. And then, with a final knot and trim of excess thread, it was done. 72 arrows complete. Oswald set down his tools and simply sat for a moment, feeling the completion settle into his awareness. 3 weeks of sustained effort had produced this result, a set of arrows as fine as any he had ever made. His hands ached deeply, his body carried accumulated fatigue, but beneath these physical sensations lay profound satisfaction. The task had been demanding, and he had met its demands fully. He stood and stretched, working out the stiffness in his back and shoulders. The day was not yet half spent. Time remained for the final inspection of all 72 arrows. This would be meticulous work, examining each arrow individually to ensure no flaw had escaped notice during production. The guests would arrive tomorrow, and the arrows needed to be absolutely ready. He retrieved the arrows from their storage barrel, handling each one with care. They emerged in the order they had been completed, first to last. He laid them out on his largest work surface, arranging them in rows of 12. 6 sets of 12 arrows, each set destined for a different guest. The visual impact of seeing them all together was striking. Uniform excellence multiplied 72 times. The inspection began with the first arrow. He examined its shaft for straightness, checking along its length from multiple angles. He tested the fletching bindings, ensuring they held firmly. He checked the balance, the weight, the overall integrity. Finding no flaw, he set it aside and moved to the second arrow. The process repeated, one arrow at a time, with the same thorough attention for each. Hours passed in this careful examination. The cat dozed and woke and dozed again. The fire required periodic attention. Outside, the manor continued its preparations for tomorrow's guests. But in the workshop, time moved at the pace of quality assurance, slow, deliberate, uncompromising. Each arrow had to pass Oswald's exacting standards, or it would be replaced. By early afternoon, 60 arrows had passed inspection. 12 remained. Oswald's observant nature had found only minor issues. A single thread slightly loose on one arrow, requiring additional wrapping. A fletching on another that sat fractionally off position, necessitating careful adjustment. Small imperfections, easily corrected, confirming that his standards during production had been appropriately high. The final dozen arrows received the same scrutiny as the first. One by one they were examined, tested, approved. When the 72nd arrow passed its inspection and joined the others, Oswald felt a wave of relief mixed with pride. The work was complete, and it was excellent work. Every arrow met his highest standards. The guests would receive gifts worthy of their status and the occasion. He organized the arrows into their 6 sets, bundling each dozen together with soft cloth to protect the fletchings during transport. Each bundle was tied with cord, then labeled with a small wooden tag knotting the set number. The organization would make distribution easier when the time came. Everything done properly, nothing left to chance. The afternoon was advancing toward evening when the steward arrived, accompanied by 2 servants carrying a wooden case. The case was beautifully made, divided into compartments lined with felt to hold the arrow sets securely. Clearly, it had been commissioned specifically for this purpose, another element of the manor's careful preparation. "Master Oswald," the steward said, his tone respectful, "I have come to collect the arrows if they are ready." "They are ready," Oswald confirmed, gesturing toward the bundled sets on his bench. The steward approached and lifted one bundle, unwrapping it carefully. He examined several arrows with evident appreciation, noting their quality. "These are exceptional," he said. "The Lord will be very pleased. The guests will receive gifts that honor them appropriately." He gestured to the servants, who began transferring the arrow sets into the case's compartments. Each bundle fit perfectly, held securely by the felt lining. When all 6 sets were placed, the case was closed and latched. The steward turned to Oswald with a slight smile. "The Lord has asked me to convey his thanks for your excellent work," he said. "Additional payment beyond the agreed amount will be delivered to your cottage this evening, in recognition of the quality you have achieved." Oswald nodded his acceptance, neither dismissing the praise nor dwelling on it excessively. "I am glad the arrows meet requirements," he said simply. "They will serve well." The steward and servants departed, carrying the case between them carefully. Oswald watched them go, feeling the particular emptiness that came after completing a major task. The arrows that had occupied his attention for 3 weeks were gone, passing beyond his care into whatever future awaited them. His workshop seemed suddenly quieter, as if it too recognized the shift. He stood in the doorway as twilight approached, looking out at the manor grounds. Tomorrow the guests would arrive and the hunt would take place. Some of his arrows might fly, might strike targets, might fulfill their purpose, or they might simply serve as beautiful gifts, kept and admired but never used. Either outcome was acceptable. He had made them as well as he could. Their fate beyond that was not his concern. The evening air was very cold now, winter's presence undeniable. He stepped back inside and began his closing routine, moving through the familiar sequence with particular attention. Today marked not just the end of a workday, but the completion of a significant undertaking. The workshop deserved acknowledgement for serving as the space where excellence had been pursued and achieved. Tools were cleaned with extra care. The bench was swept thoroughly. The fire was banked to preserve coals through the night. Everything was restored to its usual order, ready for tomorrow's return to regular work. The special order was finished. Normal rhythms would resume. At the cottage, he found a small leather pouch waiting outside his door, the additional payment the steward had mentioned. Oswald brought it inside and set it on his table without counting its contents. The money was appreciated but secondary to the satisfaction of work well done. Payment measured external value. His own sense of accomplishment measured something deeper. He prepared his evening meal with more attention than usual, adding dried meat and extra vegetables to the pottage. Tonight felt worthy of modest celebration, even if that celebration consisted only of slightly richer food. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, allowing his body to recognize that the intense period had ended. Rest would come easier now, knowing the demanding task was complete. After eating, he brought out his applewood bowl for the first time in 3 weeks. The carving felt good in his hands, its familiar curves welcome after the endless succession of arrow shafts. He worked on it contentedly, removing small amounts of wood, gradually deepening the interior. The bowl would be finished in its own time. There was no deadline, no external expectation, just the quiet pleasure of making something useful and beautiful. The fire burned steadily, filling the cottage with warmth. Outside, the manor prepared for tomorrow's important guests, but Oswald's mind had already moved past the special order. Tomorrow he would return to regular work, standard arrows for the guards, repairs as needed, teaching his nephew, maintaining his workshop. The rhythms that had sustained him for years would resume their comfortable flow. He worked on the bowl until his hands grew tired, then set it aside with satisfaction. The day had been good, completion achieved, quality maintained, obligations fulfilled. He prepared for bed feeling the deep contentment that had always defined his emotional baseline. This was not excitement or dramatic joy, but something steadier and more sustaining. Peace born from work done properly and standards upheld. The straw mattress received him with familiar accommodation. Wool blankets wrapped around his body, holding warmth close. His work-reddened hands rested on the covers, finally released from their sustained demands. The ache in his joints would diminish over coming days as regular rhythms returned. For now, he simply accepted the discomfort as evidence of effort given fully. His breathing deepened naturally as sleep approached. Thoughts drifted without particular direction, memories of the past 3 weeks, anticipation of tomorrow's return to normal work, appreciation for his nephew's help, gratitude for the workshop's reliability. Nothing dramatic or urgent, just the quiet mental wandering that preceded rest. Outside, stars shone brilliantly in the clear, cold sky. The manor's buildings stood dark and silent, their inhabitants already abed. In the great hall, the case containing 72 exceptional arrows waited for tomorrow's presentation. And in his cottage, Oswald, 41 years old, with work-reddened hands and graying red beard, found sleep easily, his body and mind both settling into rest that was earned and deserved, complete and peaceful, carrying him gently into dreams of simple, ordinary days returning. The kind of days that form the foundation of a life well lived, measured not in dramatic moments but in steady devotion to craft, in patient teaching, in quiet satisfaction. In the deep contentment that came from knowing his work was good, his standards maintained, his purpose clear. Sleep held him through the night, undisturbed and restorative, preparing him for the morning when regular rhythms would resume, when the workshop would once again fill with the familiar sounds of steady labor, when arrows would be made not for important guests but for daily needs, when life would return to its comfortable patterns, one day following the next in reliable succession, each bringing its own modest tasks and quiet rewards, continuing forward through the seasons, through the years. In the timeless rhythm of work, done well and life lived with purpose. Morning arrived with crystalline clarity. Oswald woke to find sunlight streaming through the cottage window, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the still air. The day of the guests' arrival had come, though his own involvement with their visit had already concluded. Today he would return to the familiar patterns that had sustained him for years, regular arrows, routine repairs, the comfortable rhythm of ordinary work. He dressed without hurry and stepped outside into cold that bit sharply, but not unpleasantly. The ground was frozen solid, frost patterns decorating every surface with delicate crystalline designs. His breath formed thick clouds that hung briefly before dissipating. At the well, ice had formed again across the water's surface, requiring the bucket's edge to break through before drawing up the cold, clear liquid. The walk to the workshop traversed ground that crunched beneath his feet, each step creating small sounds in the morning stillness. The manor showed signs of early activity, servants moving with particular purpose, the kitchen already releasing rich aromas, the stable yard busy with preparations. The guests would arrive by midday, and everything needed to be perfect. But these preparations were no longer Oswald's concern. His contribution was complete. At the workshop, he built the fire with his usual care, watching flames grow and spread warmth through the space. The cat appeared and settled into its preferred spot, as if the previous 3 weeks of intensive work had been merely an interruption in its eternal routine of sleeping and grooming. Oswald smiled at this consistency. The animal knew what mattered: warmth, food, comfort, rest. Everything else was human complication. He moved to his timber stores and selected ash shafts for standard arrows. After weeks of working with perfect materials, these ordinary pieces felt different in his hands, still good quality but not exceptional, suitable for daily use rather than special presentation. The contrast was noticeable, yet he felt no disappointment. Not every arrow needed to be extraordinary. Most work was ordinary work, and there was honor in doing it well. The drawknife settled into his palms with familiar weight. He secured the first shaft in his vise and made the initial stroke. Wood curled away from the blade in a pale ribbon. The motion was automatic, his body remembering the pattern without conscious direction. His humming began, plain chant melodies filling the workshop as they had filled it countless times before. Everything was returning to its proper rhythm. The morning progressed through its familiar stages. Shafts were shaped, one after another, with competent efficiency rather than exceptional scrutiny. These arrows would serve the guards well without being remarkable. They would fly straight, strike true, and eventually wear out or break, to be replaced by others equally adequate. This was the bulk of his work, reliable production of useful items. The special orders were rare interruptions in a pattern of steady, unremarkable excellence. By mid-morning, distant sounds indicated the guests' arrival: horses on the road, voices calling greetings, the manor coming alive with heightened activity. Oswald continued his work without pausing to investigate. The hunt would happen later, perhaps tomorrow. His arrows might be used, might prove their quality in actual flight, or they might remain beautiful gifts, never tested. Either way, his part was finished. His nephew arrived near midday, excitement evident in his manner. "Uncle, the guests have arrived. Such fine horses and clothing. The Lord is showing them the manor grounds. Later there will be a great feast." Oswald nodded, acknowledging the boy's enthusiasm without fully sharing it. "That is good. The manor honors its guests appropriately." "Will you attend the feast?" the nephew asked hopefully. "I think not," Oswald replied. "Such gatherings are not suited to my nature. I am content here with my work and my peace." The boy seemed to understand, though perhaps with faint disappointment. He settled onto his stool and began preparing thread, falling into the comfortable routine they had established. His hands moved with increased confidence now, the result of weeks of practice. He had improved noticeably during the period of the special order, even with limited direct instruction. They worked together through the afternoon in companionable silence. Oswald shaped shafts while his nephew prepared materials, each occupied with tasks appropriate to their skill level. The workshop held them both comfortably, providing space for shared labor without requiring constant conversation. Sometimes the best teaching happened through simple presence and example. Outside, the afternoon progressed toward evening. Sounds of celebration began drifting from the manor house, music, laughter, the general noise of feasting. The guests were being entertained lavishly, as befitted their status. Oswald felt no regret at missing the festivities. Crowds and noise held no appeal for him. The workshop's quiet productivity brought deeper satisfaction than any feast could provide. As twilight approached, his nephew prepared to depart. "Thank you for teaching me today," the boy said formally. "You did good work," Oswald replied. "Your hands grow stronger each time you come. Continue practicing and the skill will come." The child left with visible pleasure at the praise, walking toward the manor house where his family's quarters lay. Oswald watched him go, feeling quiet satisfaction in the teaching relationship. The boy would likely never become a master Fletcher. Few apprentices reached that level, but he would gain useful skills and understanding of honest craft. That was valuable in itself. Oswald completed his evening routine as the manor's celebration continued in the distance. Tools cleaned, surfaces swept, fire banked. The workshop returned to its dormant state, waiting for tomorrow's reactivation. Everything in its place, everything ready. The order and reliability of this daily pattern brought comfort that no special occasion could match. At the cottage, he prepared his evening meal while sounds of music and laughter carried through the cold air. The contrast between the manor's festivity and his own solitary quiet was stark but not troubling. Different people found satisfaction in different circumstances. He had learned long ago that his contentment came from steady work, simple routine, and the absence of excessive stimulation. He ate his pottage slowly, tasting the familiar flavors: barley, turnips, herbs, the slight bitterness of ale added for moisture. Simple food honestly made adequate for needs. He required nothing more elaborate. After eating, he brought out his apple wood bowl and resumed carving. The work progressed incrementally, each session adding small refinements. Months from now it would be complete. Until then, it provided pleasant occupation for evening hours. The fire burned steadily, its warmth pushing back against the night's cold. Outside, the celebration continued, though gradually diminishing as the hour grew later. Eventually the music stopped, the voices quieted, and the manor settled into nighttime stillness. The guests had been welcomed, entertained, and now presumably retired to their accommodations. Tomorrow would bring the hunt, and perhaps his arrows would fly. Oswald worked on the bowl until fatigue came, then set it aside. His hands felt better tonight, the ache diminishing as they recovered from 3 weeks of sustained effort. Regular work would allow complete healing over coming days. He prepared for bed, moving through the sequence with practiced efficiency. The cottage had accumulated good warmth from the fire, making the space cozy despite the freezing temperature beyond its walls. The straw mattress received him with familiar accommodation. Wool blankets wrapped around his body, creating a cocoon of warmth. His work-reddened hands rested comfortably, no longer throbbing as they had in recent evenings. His breathing deepened naturally, the transition to sleep coming easily. The deep contentment that defined his emotional baseline settled over him like an additional blanket, intangible but real, comfort born from life lived according to his own nature. Tomorrow would bring another day of ordinary work. Shafts to shape, arrows to fletch, perhaps repairs to complete. His nephew might visit again, continuing his gradual learning. The guests would have their hunt, and life at the manor would eventually return to normal rhythms. Everything moved in cycles, special orders and routine work, celebration and quiet labor, winter's cold and spring's eventual warmth. Sleep claimed him gently, consciousness fading into rest without resistance. His body surrendered to the night's embrace, finding the restoration it needed. Dreams came softly, images of wood grain and feather patterns, the weight of tools in his hands, sunlight moving across the workshop floor. Pleasant dreams, untroubled and mild, reflecting a life of steady purpose and quiet satisfaction. The night deepened around the cottage. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The manor stood silent, its inhabitants resting after the day's excitement. In the guest quarters, visitors slept in comfortable beds, unaware perhaps of the craftsman whose skill had created their gifts. And in his simple cottage, Oswald, 41 years old, with work-reddened hands and graying red beard, rested in profound peace. The peace that came from knowing his work was good, his standards maintained, his life lived with integrity and purpose, measured not in acclaim or recognition, but in the quiet satisfaction of craft pursued with devotion, in the teaching passed to younger hands, in the reliable rhythm of days spent in meaningful labor. Continuing forward through seasons and years in the timeless pattern of work done well and purpose fulfilled, sleeping now in deep and dreamless rest, held by the night's gentle darkness, restored by sleep's healing power, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring, content in the simple certainty that his life had meaning, his work had value, and his days followed patterns that brought him the deepest form of satisfaction, not excitement or drama, but the steady, reliable contentment of a life lived according to his own nature, in harmony with his craft, in peace with his circumstances, sleeping now, deeply and completely, as the night held him in its quiet embrace. The following morning brought the hunt, though Oswald heard of it only distantly, horses departing, voices calling, the sounds gradually fading as the party moved toward the forest. He worked steadily in his workshop, shaping shafts for standard arrows, his hands moving through familiar motions. Whether his special arrows flew true or remained unused, he would likely never know. The thought brought neither curiosity nor concern. His work was complete. By midday, the hunting party returned. Oswald heard the commotion of their arrival, excited voices, horses being led to the stables, the general energy of a successful outing. He continued his work without interruption, smoothing a shaft with his leather, feeling the wood grow polished beneath his patient attention. The hunt's success or failure changed nothing about his day's tasks. Later that afternoon, the steward appeared once more at the workshop door. His expression carried satisfaction. "Master Oswald," he said, "I bring word from the Lord and his guests. Your arrows performed magnificently. 3 deer were taken, and every arrow that was loosed flew straight and true. The guests were greatly impressed by their gifts." Oswald nodded, accepting the information with his characteristic quietness. "I am pleased they served well," he said simply. The steward smiled at this measured response. "The Lord wishes you to know that your reputation brings honor to the manor. Should future special orders be needed, you will be the first called upon." After the steward departed, Oswald returned to his work. The praise was acknowledged but not dwelt upon. Arrows that flew true were arrows properly made, the expected result of skill and care. He felt satisfaction in hearing of their success, but this satisfaction was quiet, internal, requiring no external celebration. The work itself had been its own reward. The days that followed saw the guests depart. The manor returned to its normal rhythms, and winter settled more deeply over the land. Snow came, light dustings at first, then heavier falls that blanketed the ground in white. The workshop required larger fires, and Oswald's breath formed constant clouds even inside. But work continued without pause. Arrows were always needed, regardless of weather. His nephew's visits became more regular as winter limited outdoor activities at the manor. The boy's skill grew steadily under Oswald's patient instruction. He could now prepare materials competently and had begun learning actual fletching, though his early attempts were clumsy. Oswald corrected without criticism, remembering his own awkward beginnings decades ago. Skill came through practice and time. The boy had both available to him. On particularly cold evenings, Oswald worked on his apple wood bowl by firelight, the carving gradually nearing completion. The interior had achieved proper depth. The walls maintained even thickness, and he had begun adding simple decoration to the exterior, a band of carved lines that followed the bowl's curve. The work pleased him. This object made without deadline or external expectation, shaped purely according to his own vision and pace. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, darkness coming early and lingering late. But the workshop remained a place of warmth and productivity, the fire always burning, tools always ready, work always progressing. Oswald moved through the season's demands with steady competence, neither rushed by urgency nor slowed by cold. Each day brought its tasks. Each task received proper attention, and each completion added to the accumulated total of work well done. The manor's life continued around him. Seasonal festivals, daily routines, the constant flow of activities that filled a large household. Oswald participated minimally in communal events, preferring his workshop's solitude and his cottage's peace. This was not isolation born of difficulty, but choice born of self-knowledge. He understood what brought him contentment, and he arranged his life accordingly. Snow fell on the workshop roof, muffling sounds and creating a sense of enclosure. Inside, Oswald shaped wood and bound feathers, his hands moving through motions refined over a lifetime. The cat dozed in its eternal spot near the hearth. The fire crackled softly. Plainchant melodies rose and fell in the warm air, and arrows emerged one by one, continuing the endless succession that had defined his working years and would continue defining them until age or infirmity ended his craft. But such endings lay in an uncertain future. Today held only the present moment, wood beneath his fingers, warmth on his face, the familiar weight of tools in his work-reddened hands. His graying red beard had perhaps a few more gray hairs than last season, evidence of time's passage, but his skill remained undiminished. 41 years had brought him to this point, a master craftsman in full command of his abilities, content in his circumstances, at peace with his choices. The afternoon light, pale and filtered through snow-heavy clouds, slanted through the workshop doorway. Oswald held up the arrow he had just completed, examining it against the light. The shaft was straight, the fletching sat perfectly, the balance was true. Another good arrow made well, ready to serve its purpose. He set it in the drying rack alongside others and reached for a new shaft, beginning the process again. Outside, snow continued falling in soft, steady flakes. The world grew quieter beneath its accumulation, sounds muffled and softened. But in the workshop, life continued its purposeful rhythm. Wood shavings fell, thread wrapped around shaft and feather. The fire burned steadily. And Oswald, 41 years old, with work-reddened hands and graying red beard, continued his craft, unhurried, focused, content, living the life he had chosen, pursuing the work he loved, finding in simple, daily labor the deep and lasting satisfaction that came from purpose clearly understood and faithfully pursued. His days following one upon another in reliable succession, each bringing its modest tasks and quiet rewards, continuing forward through the seasons, through the years. In the timeless pattern of work done well and life lived with integrity, moving now through this winter afternoon in his warm workshop, his hands steady, his heart peaceful, his spirit resting in the profound contentment that had always been and would always be the truest expression of who he was, a Fletcher, a craftsman, a teacher, a man who had found his place in the world and occupied it with quiet dignity, making arrows that flew straight and true, just as his own life followed its straight and true course. Held steady by devotion to craft and guided by standards that never wavered, working still as the snow fell outside and the fire burned within, his breathing calm, his movements sure, his peace complete and unshakable, continuing his labor as the light slowly faded and evening approached, working until the natural end of the day arrived, when he would secure his workshop, walk to his cottage, eat his simple meal, rest by his fire, and eventually sleep, deeply, peacefully, completely, before waking to begin again, as he had done for years and would continue doing for years to come, each day a repetition and each day unique, the pattern endless and endlessly satisfying. His life a quiet testimony to the value of work done well, of purpose steadily pursued, of contentment found not in drama or excitement, but in the reliable rhythm of meaningful labor, continuing now and always, through winter's cold and spring's renewal, through summer's warmth and autumn's harvest, the wheel turning, the seasons changing but his work remaining constant, his peace enduring, his contentment deep and true, as lasting as the arrows he crafted and as steady as the hands that made them.